The key was cold and heavy in Eleanor's palm. It pressed into her skin like a small warning. She closed her fingers around it and said nothing. There was nothing to say. The ceremony had taken less than an hour. Edmund Hardcastle, the Duke of Ashenvale, had signed the register without looking at her, shaken the solicitor's hand, nodded once in her direction, and walked out of the church into the November morning as though he had just completed a routine business errand. Eleanor stood at the church door and watched his carriage disappear down the lane. The iron key sat in her hand. That was all he had left her with. A key and a title and the sound of hooves fading in the distance. Her maid, Clara, appeared at her elbow with a folded shawl. "Your Grace," she said softly, and Eleanor felt the strangeness of those two words land on her like cold water. Your Grace. She was 23 years old. She had grown up in a house where the roof leaked in 3 places and the library was the only warm room. She had read every book in that library twice. She had learned French and Latin not because they were fashionable, but because there was nothing else to do in a house where the money was quietly, steadily running out. Her father had arranged the marriage 18 months earlier. He had told her, with the honesty that comes when there is no time left for softness, that the family could not continue as it was. The estate in Derbyshire was mortgaged. The tenants were leaving. The name Voss, which had once meant something in the county, now meant a family that smiled at dinner and worried in the dark. Edmund Hardcastle had approached through a mutual solicitor. He needed a wife of good family and reasonable character. He was prepared to be generous. Eleanor had met him twice before the wedding, once at a dinner in London that lasted 4 hours, and during which he spoke to her for perhaps 15 minutes. He was tall, quieter than she expected for a man of his rank, with gray eyes that seemed to be looking at something beyond whatever room he was in. He was not unkind. He simply was not present, not really, not even when he was standing directly in front of her. The second meeting was a brief tea at which they had discussed the weather and the state of the northern roads and nothing that mattered at all. She had not expected love. She was practical enough to know that love was not what was being offered, but she had, in some quiet corner of herself, hoped for something. Some signal that she was entering a life with another person in it, that the years ahead would hold at least the company of a man she might come to understand. What she had received instead was a key and a carriage north. The carriage that carried Eleanor to Ashenvale was comfortable and cold. She had 2 trunks, 3 boxes of books, Clara, and the address of a castle she had never seen. The roads grew rougher as they moved into the north. The villages became smaller and further apart. The light had a quality she had not seen before, pale and wide, spreading itself thinly across moorland that seemed to go on forever without apology. She kept the curtain pulled back and watched it all. Clara fell asleep somewhere past the 3rd hour. Eleanor did not. She kept the iron key on her lap and thought carefully about what she knew. She knew that Ashenvale Castle had been in the Hardcastle family for 200 years. She knew that the estate included farmland, tenant properties, and a stretch of moorland that had once been used for grouse hunting. She knew that Edmund's father had died 4 years ago, and that his mother had returned to her family in Scotland shortly after. She knew, because the solicitor had mentioned it with careful neutrality, that the estate had not been managed with full attention in recent years. She had not asked what that meant. She had a feeling she would find out. The castle appeared through the carriage window just as the afternoon light began to fail. Eleanor leaned forward and looked. It was enormous. Gray stone, 4 stories at the main face, towers at 2 corners, windows that caught the last of the pale light and threw it back like dull mirrors. It sat on a rise above the village of Ashenvale-under-Moor with the settled confidence of something that had been there a very long time and expected to remain. There was a long gravel drive lined with bare lime trees, their branches making dark patterns against a sky the color of pewter. The carriage stopped at the main entrance. A woman was already standing at the door, broad-shouldered, gray-haired, dressed in black with a white collar, holding herself with the particular stillness of someone who has been waiting and has made peace with waiting. She introduced herself as Mrs. Holt, the head housekeeper. "Your Grace," she said, with a bow of the head that was perfectly respectful and entirely unreadable. "Welcome to Ashenvale." The entrance hall was tall and cold. There were paintings on the walls. Hardcastle men going back generations. Their faces settled into the same expression of faint distance that Eleanor had seen on Edmund's face. There were 2 footmen, a parlor maid, and a boy of perhaps 14 who seemed to be the underfootman, and who looked at Eleanor with open curiosity, until Mrs. Holt's gaze moved in his direction, and he looked at the floor instead. Mrs. Holt showed her through the ground floor. The great hall was beautiful in the way that neglected things sometimes are, high-ceilinged, with good proportions and carved stonework around the fireplace, but the rugs were worn through in the center, and there was a smell of damp that moved in from somewhere to the east. The drawing room had good furniture, all of it under covers. The dining room had a table that could seat 20, and currently held a branch of dried flowers in a cracked vase. The library had books, real ones, many of them, floor to ceiling, and Eleanor felt for the first time something that was not quite dread. "How many staff are there?" she asked. "At present, Your Grace, 8 indoor staff and 3 groundskeepers. There were more, but—" Mrs. Holt paused with the careful pause of a woman choosing words. "His Grace has been away a great deal. Some of the staff chose not to remain." "I see," said Eleanor. She was shown to her rooms on the 2nd floor. They were large and clean and had clearly been prepared with some effort. There was a fire burning. Clara unpacked with quiet efficiency. Eleanor sat at the window and looked out over the moor, which was now entirely dark, a vast and featureless darkness that pressed against the glass. She had a letter to write. She sat at the small writing desk and took out paper and pen. She wrote to her father first, brief, reassuring, giving nothing away. Then she wrote to Edmund. She had his address in Vienna, given to her by the solicitor. She wrote 3 sentences. She told him she had arrived safely. She told him the castle was as she had expected. She told him she hoped his travel had been comfortable. She signed it Eleanor Hardcastle and looked at the name for a moment before folding the paper. Eleanor Hardcastle. The name sat on the page like something belonging to a stranger. She folded it carefully, sealed it, and set it on the corner of the desk for Clara to post in the morning. Then she picked up the iron key, held it in her palm for a moment, and set it beside the letter. She stood, went to the window again, and looked out at the dark moor with its darkness and its silence and its absolute, unapologetic emptiness. She was not going to cry. She had made that decision somewhere on the road north, and she held to it with the same quiet stubbornness that had carried her through 2 years of careful preparation for a future that had turned out to be this. She was not going to be sentimental about what she had hoped for. She was going to deal with what she had. She turned away from the window and went to bed. She lay awake for a long time, listening to the sound of the castle around her. Old buildings speak at night, the tick and creak of stone and timber adjusting to the cold, the sound of wind finding the gaps it has always known. Ashenvale spoke in low, settled tones, like an old man muttering in his sleep. There was a loose shutter somewhere on the east side that tapped with each gust. The chimney in her bedroom drew well, which she was glad of. The fire burned steadily and threw moving light across the ceiling. She thought about Edmund on his train to Vienna. She tried to imagine what he was thinking, if he was thinking about her at all. She found she could not imagine it. He was too much a stranger. She knew his name, his height, the color of his eyes, and the fact that he shook solicitors' hands more warmly than he acknowledged his new wife. That was all. That was what she had married. She thought about Mrs. Holt and the careful pauses. She thought about the worn rugs and the cracked vase and the smell of damp coming from the east wing. She thought about the 3 groundskeepers and the staff who had chosen not to remain. By the time the fire had burned down to embers, Eleanor had made several decisions. She was not entirely sure they were the right ones, but she was sure that they were better than the alternative, which was to sit in this cold castle and wait for a man who had already demonstrated that he was not coming back soon. She was going to learn everything about this place. She was going to understand the accounts and the land and the tenants and the staff. She was going to open every room and read every document and walk every field. She was not going to ask Edmund's permission for each decision she made, because he had made it clear, in the only way available to him, that he trusted her to manage. Whether he actually trusted her or simply did not care enough to be bothered, she did not yet know, and for now, it did not matter. What mattered was the key on the writing desk, cold and heavy and real. She would learn what it opened. The next morning, she was dressed and downstairs before Mrs. Holt had expected her. The housekeeper was in the kitchen corridor, going over the day's arrangements with the cook, when Eleanor appeared. There was a moment of surprise, quickly covered. "Your Grace, breakfast is being laid in the morning room." "Thank you," said Eleanor. "After breakfast, I would like a full tour of the house. Not the rooms that have been prepared for me, all of it, every floor, every wing. And then I would like to see the account books." Another pause, more careful than the first. "The account books, Your Grace." "Yes," said Eleanor pleasantly. "All of them, please, going back as far as we have them." Mrs. Holt looked at her with the expression of a woman recalibrating an expectation. Then she nodded. "Of course, Your Grace. After breakfast." The account books were kept in a room off the main corridor that had once been a steward's office. There had not been a steward in 3 years, Mrs. Holt explained, leading Eleanor into a room that smelled of old paper and undisturbed air. The books were on a shelf in order of year, which was promising. Eleanor pulled the 3 most recent and carried them to the desk. She spent the rest of the morning reading them. The picture they told was not a catastrophe. It was something subtler and in some ways more troubling. The picture of an estate that had once run well, that still had the bones of good management, but that had been slowly losing ground for several years. Income was steady but declining. Maintenance had been deferred repeatedly. The household costs were reasonable, but there were gaps, regular gaps where repairs had been noted as needed and then nothing further appeared. No follow-up, no payment, just a note and then silence. The East Wing, Eleanor noted, appeared in the records 3 years ago as requiring roof work and had not appeared since. She went to look at the East Wing that afternoon. Mrs. Holt walked with her, 2 steps behind, carrying a lamp. The East Wing was cold in a different way from the rest of the castle, the cold of sealed air and stopped time. The corridor was dark, the curtains in each room drawn, the furniture sheeted. Eleanor walked through slowly, opening curtains as she went. In the third room she could see, even in the gray winter light, the line of water damage across the ceiling, a long brown stain that had spread and dried and spread again over what looked like 2 or 3 years. "The roof," she said. "Yes, Your Grace." "How bad is it?" "One of the groundskeepers went up last spring. He said 2 sections needed replacing. If it is not done before the heavy snow, it will be worse," Eleanor said. She turned and looked at Mrs. Holt directly. "I need you to tell me the truth about this house, not what you think I should hear, the truth." The housekeeper met her eyes for a long moment. Then something shifted in her expression, not warmth exactly, but respect, or the beginning of it. "The roof is the most urgent," she said. "The kitchen hearth smokes when the wind is from the north and the flue needs clearing. The pump in the courtyard freezes every winter and needs replacing. 2 of the tenant cottages on the East Lane are in poor condition, and the families there have been patient a long time." Eleanor nodded slowly. "Thank you," she said. "I would like a written list, everything that needs doing, in order of urgency." She walked back through the sealed rooms of the East Wing, and in each one she pulled back the curtains before she left. The afternoon light, thin as it was, came in, and touched things that had not been touched in years. It was not much, but it was a beginning. At dinner that evening, eating alone at one end of the long dining room table, Eleanor made notes on a piece of paper beside her plate. She wrote down the roof, the flue, the pump, the cottages. She wrote down the name of the solicitor in the nearest town who handled the estate's affairs. She wrote down a question: what is the income from the moorland, if any? She ate everything on her plate because the cook, a quietly talented woman named Mrs. Bray, had made a beef broth that was exactly right for a cold evening, and wasting good cooking seemed to Eleanor a particular kind of ingratitude. After dinner, she went back to the library. She found, on the 3rd shelf from the left, a section of books on agricultural management, and another on estate law. She took 3 of them and carried them upstairs. Clara was waiting to help her prepare for bed, and Eleanor sat in the chair by the rebuilt fire and read for 2 hours before she slept. She dreamed nothing that she remembered. In the morning, there was a letter on the silver tray in the entrance hall. She recognized the handwriting immediately. It was from her father, which was impossible since she had only sent her letter yesterday, which meant this had been written and posted before she arrived. Her father, who knew her well, had written it knowing she might need it in the first days. "You are more capable than you know," he had written. "This is not a life I would have chosen for you, but you will make something of it that I could never have predicted. I am certain of this." She folded the letter and put it in her pocket, and kept it there for the rest of the day. She went out after breakfast, on foot, to look at the tenant cottages on the East Lane. The first family she met was a man named George Parr, who worked a small piece of farmland, and who opened his front door with the cautious expression of a man who has learned not to expect too much from Harcastle visits. He was surprised when Eleanor asked to see the roof from inside. He was more surprised when she stood in his back room, looked at the damage above the window frame, and said, "I will have someone out to look at this within the week." He looked at her steadily for a moment. "The last time someone was coming to look," he said, "was 2 years ago." "I know," Eleanor said. "I am sorry. It will not be 2 years again." She could not tell from his face whether he believed her. She did not blame him for not believing her yet. She walked back to the castle across the frozen mud of the lane, with the wind pressing hard from the north, and she thought about what it meant to make a promise to a man who had been disappointed too many times to trust easily. She thought about how a place earns trust, not through words, but through the steady, unglamorous work of showing up and following through. She was going to show up. She was going to follow through. The iron key was on her writing desk. In the afternoon, she took it to Mrs. Holt and asked her what it opened. Mrs. Holt looked at it for a long moment. "That," she said slowly, "is the key to the East Wing, the main key. There are 6 rooms that have been locked rather than sheeted. His Grace's," she paused, "the previous Duke's study, and 5 storerooms, I believe. Then we will begin there, said Eleanor. "Tomorrow morning." She put the key in her pocket, next to her father's letter, and went to write in her journal. The first entry was short. She wrote, "Arrived safely. The house is large and in need of attention. The people here are watchful and careful and not yet sure what to make of me. I am not sure what to make of this either, but I intend to find out." She paused, then added one more line. "I will not waste this. Whatever it is, I will not waste it." She closed the journal. Outside, the north wind moved across the moor in long, slow waves, and the lime trees on the drive bent and straightened and bent again, patient as everything that has learned to weather what it cannot change. The east wing smelled of time. There was no other way to describe it. Not rot, not mold exactly, but the specific smell of years piling up in a closed space, layer on layer, undisturbed. Eleanor stood in the corridor the following morning with the iron key in her hand and a lamp held by Mrs. Holt at her shoulder, and she breathed it in and thought, "Someone shut this door and walked away and never came back." She put the key in the first lock and turned it. The study had been the previous Duke's room, Edmund's father's space. It was clear from the way things had been left, not cleared away, not arranged for someone else, simply stopped. There was a pen on the desk with dried ink in its nib. There was a glass beside the window that still held a faint residue at the bottom. There was a pair of reading spectacles folded on top of a letter that had never been sent. She could see the salutation from across the room without wanting to read further. The curtains were heavy velvet, dark green, and when Eleanor took hold of one edge and drew it back, the fabric released a great slow cloud of dust that hung in the pale winter light like smoke. She did not touch the letter. She did not touch the spectacles. But she opened all the curtains, every one, and when the light came in, it showed her a room that had been, in its time, a good room. Shelved walls, a wide oak desk, a fireplace with good tiles. Under the dust and the stopped time, there was something solid. "This room can be made useful again," she said. Mrs. Holt said nothing, which Eleanor was beginning to understand was the housekeeper's way of saying that she was listening carefully and had not yet decided what she thought. They moved through the 5 locked storerooms. 2 of them held furniture, chairs and tables stacked under sheeting, things that had been moved aside at some point without a plan for what came next. One held crates that turned out to contain china, the good formal china, packed carefully in straw as if being stored for a move that never happened. One held old account books going back much further than the ones in the steward's office. Going back, Eleanor discovered as she lifted the first and opened it carefully. Nearly 60 years, and the last room held nothing at all except a small wooden chest that was not locked. She opened it. Inside were letters tied in bundles, a miniature portrait of a woman in a gold frame, and a folded document that turned out to be the original land survey of the Ashenvale estate dated 1791. The map inside showed every field, every boundary, every tenant plot, drawn by a careful hand in ink that had faded to brown. She held it in both hands and looked at it for a long time. "I will need a table in here," she said, "and better light." "Yes, Your Grace." Eleanor spent the better part of 2 weeks in those rooms. She was methodical about it. She began with the oldest account books, working forward, reading them not for pleasure but for information, what the estate had earned in better years, what it had spent, where the money had gone and where it had dried up. She made notes. She drew comparisons. By the end of the first week, she had a picture that was clearer and more complicated than she had expected. The estate had been genuinely prosperous 40 years ago. The moorland had been leased to a shooting syndicate at good rates. The farms had been productive and well managed by a steward named Hutchins, who appeared in the records as a steady, careful presence for nearly 20 years. When Hutchins died, there had been another steward, then another, then a long gap. The shooting lease had not been renewed. Some of the farmland had been left fallow. The pattern was not dramatic, no single disaster, no moment of ruin. It was the pattern of slow inattention, of a house that had been left to manage itself and had managed less and less well as the years went by. Edmund's father had not been incompetent, she decided. He had been distracted. By what, she did not know. Perhaps she would find out. Perhaps it did not matter for her purposes. Her purposes were straightforward, if not easy. She needed to understand what the estate could produce and what it was currently producing, and then she needed to understand what stood between those two numbers. She wrote all of this out in her journal, in careful columns, because writing things out helped her think. Meanwhile, the roof. She had written to a builder in the market town of Crowden, the nearest place of any size, describing the damage in the east wing and asking for an estimate. He came on a Thursday, a solid, quiet man named Arthur Finch, who climbed onto the roof with the unhurried competence of someone who had been doing exactly this for 30 years. He came down and gave her a number that was higher than she had hoped but lower than she had feared. "How long will it take?" she asked. 3 weeks if the weather holds. 4 if we get hard frost. When can you start? He looked at her as though making sure she was serious. End of next week if you want. I want, said Eleanor. She paid the deposit from her own funds, the modest personal money that had come to her with the marriage settlement. It was not a negligible sum. She used it without hesitation because the alternative was to write to Edmund, who was currently in Paris according to his most recent letter, and ask for his approval, which would take at least 2 weeks and might produce nothing more useful than his standard 3 sentences of polite agreement. She was beginning to understand that waiting for Edmund's involvement was a choice she would have to consciously avoid making. He had left her the estate and the iron key and a title. He had not left her instructions, which meant she was going to have to make her own. The letter from Edmund arrived 2 weeks after she had posted hers. It was characteristically brief. He hoped she had settled comfortably. He noted that the winter weather in Paris was damp. He mentioned that he had attended a lecture on agricultural improvement that had been interesting, and he recommended a book on the subject, giving the author and title precisely. He signed it, as always, E. Harcastle. Eleanor read it twice. Then she went to the library and found that they already had the book he recommended. She took it upstairs and read it over 2 evenings. It was actually useful. Some of the methods it described applied directly to the farms on the estate. She made notes in the margins in pencil, lightly, the way she marked books she intended to think about more carefully later. She wrote back to him. She told him about the roof work. She told him, in broad terms, that she had been reviewing the accounts and had some ideas about the moorland lease. She asked his opinion on one specific matter, whether there was any existing relationship with the grain merchants in Croydon that she should be aware of before she approached them. She had included the question deliberately. She wanted to see if he would engage with something practical. He did. His next letter, which arrived 3 weeks later, was nearly twice as long as any previous one. He explained that the grain merchant his father had dealt with had retired, and that his son now ran the business and was, in Edmund's limited experience, a more forward-thinking man. He gave her the name. He added, almost as an aside, that he was pleased the roof was being attended to, as it had worried him. She read that last sentence several times. It had worried him. He had known about the roof. He had worried about it from Paris and done nothing because what? Because he had convinced himself that something would be arranged without his involvement? Because he did not know how to begin a task that required him to be present? She did not write back asking these questions. She noted them instead in her journal and moved on to the next practical matter. The next practical matter was the farmer on the East Lane. George Parr's cottage had received its roof repairs on the 2nd week of December, when Arthur Finch had a small break between the East Wing job and his next commission. Eleanor had arranged it without announcement, and when she walked past the following week and saw the new timber gleaming at the edge of the old slates, she felt something she had not expected. Not pride exactly, but a quiet satisfaction that sat deep and still. She knocked on the door. George Parr opened it. He looked at her, then up at his roof, then back at her. "It is done," he said. "Yes," she said. He was a man of about 50, she thought, with the weathered face of someone who spent most of his life outdoors, and the careful eyes of someone who had learned to notice things. He said nothing for a moment. Then he opened the door wider. "Will you come in for a moment, Your Grace?" She came in. His wife, whose name was Nell, brought tea without being asked, and the 3 of them sat at a kitchen table that was small and clean and warm from the stove. They talked for about half an hour. George Parr told her things about the estate that were not in any account book, which fields had the best drainage, which ones flooded in a wet spring, where the track that connected the East Lane to the main road had been washed away 3 years ago and never properly repaired. She listened to all of it and wrote it down in her notebook when she got home. It was the same in the other cottage, the Warwick family, 3 children and a father who kept a small flock of sheep on the edge of the moor. The eldest daughter, who was perhaps 10, watched Eleanor with the bright, serious eyes of a child who was paying close attention to everything. Eleanor answered the questions the girl asked, about the castle, about London, about whether she had ever seen the sea, with the same seriousness with which they were asked. Walking home across the frozen lane, she thought about the girl's questions. She thought about the fact that the nearest school was 6 miles away, which was a walk that was possible in summer but genuinely difficult in winter and impossible for very young children. She thought about the East Wing, which now had a watertight roof and 6 large, light-filled rooms. She thought about those rooms for several days before she said anything to anyone. In the meantime, she set up the old steward's office as her working room. She had it cleaned properly, the window reglazed where one pane had cracked, the chimney swept so that the fire drew correctly. She brought in a large table from the furniture stored in the East Wing storerooms and set the land survey and her notebook and the current account books on it. She spent mornings there, working. Mrs. Holt began to bring her coffee at 10 o'clock without being asked, which Eleanor took as a sign of something. She also began to learn the staff properly. Not as a category, not simply as 8 indoor people who managed the house, but as individuals. William, the head footman, was intelligent and clearly capable of more than his current role offered him, and she could see it in the careful way he performed tasks that were beneath his full ability. The kitchen maid, a girl named Harriet, had clearly been taught well, and was teaching herself further in her spare time, reading a cookery book she kept on the shelf in the kitchen that she clearly did not expect anyone to notice. Mrs. Bray, the cook, had a gift for proportion and flavor that the kitchen's limited resources did not deserve. Eleanor noticed all of it. She did not yet say anything. She was watching, still, learning the shape of things before she began to move them. One evening in January, a thin snow had fallen and the castle sat very quiet under it, and Eleanor was in the library when she found, behind a row of legal volumes on the second shelf, a thin book that had no title on its spine. She pulled it out. It was a journal, not Edmund's father's. The handwriting was different, older, and on the first page, in faded brown ink, was a date, 1831. She opened it carefully. It was the journal of a woman. A Harcastle woman, she gathered from the entries, married into the family, not born to it. She had no way of knowing her name because the journal referred to her only in the first person, the way journals do. She wrote about the castle, about the moors, about the people she was learning to know. There was an entry about the kitchen garden that made Eleanor pause. The woman described discovering, in her second year, a plot of ground behind the south wall that was sheltered from the north wind, and which had produced, she said, the most extraordinary strawberries she had ever tasted. Eleanor read for an hour. The woman's voice was clear and dry and warm. She had opinions about things. She was not afraid to put them on paper, even in a journal that no one was supposed to read. She wrote about loneliness the way practical people write about inconveniences, acknowledging it, then moving past it to what could be done with the hours. She wrote, "The moor is less daunting than it seemed at first. Like most large and silent things, it is only frightening until you learn to look at it correctly." Eleanor closed the journal carefully and held it for a moment. Then she set it on the shelf at eye level, where she would see it every day. She went to the window. The snow outside was thin and blue in the evening light. The moor beyond the garden a soft dark shape against a sky full of stars. The castle breathed around her. The tick of stone, the low voice of the wind in the chimney, the small sounds of a large house settling into the night. She was not happy yet. She was honest enough with herself to know the difference between building something and being content. But she was busy, and she was needed, and the work was real. That was not nothing. That was, she was beginning to think, quite a lot. She went to her desk and wrote to Edmund. She told him that she had been looking into the moorland and had found an old record of the shooting lease from 30 years ago. She asked if he had any objection to her making inquiries about reviving it. She mentioned briefly that she had been thinking about the East Wing and had an idea she might share with him in due course. She did not tell him about the journal. That was hers. She sealed the letter and left it for the morning post. Outside, the snow continued to fall in slow, quiet curtains, and Ashenvale Castle stood on its rise above the dark village and the dark moor, and the smoke from Eleanor's study fire rose straight up into the still winter air, the only moving thing in all that darkness and silence. She slept well that night, better than she had since she arrived. The first thaw came in February, and Eleanor was outside in it. She had been riding every morning for 3 weeks by then, even in the frost, borrowing a horse from the stable that no one else was using, a bay mare named Callie who was aging and steady and had, Eleanor suspected, been largely ignored since Edmund's departure. Callie seemed to appreciate the attention with the restrained warmth of an older creature who had learned not to expect too much. She walked at a good pace and did not shy at anything, and knew the estate paths better than Eleanor did. Eleanor let her lead, sometimes. It was a good way to learn. On the February morning after the first thaw, she rode out to the moorland. The ground was soft under the mare's hooves, and in places where the track crossed low ground it sank, and pressed in a way that suggested the drainage problems George Parr had mentioned were very real. She stopped in several places and looked carefully. She had been reading, in the evenings, about land drainage. The books she had found in the library were theoretical, but the land itself was the practical version, and between the two she was beginning to understand something. She had also, by this point, spoken with every one of the estate's 6 tenant farmers. Some of these conversations had been easier than others. The farm furthest north, worked by a man named Henry Bolt who had been there for 20 years, had been the most interesting. Henry Bolt was about 60, a man with the measured speech of someone who considers each word before releasing it. He had not, initially, been enthusiastic about the Duchess arriving on his doorstep asking questions. He had answered them, because she was the Duchess and he was a practical man, but his answers had been brief and carefully limited. Then she had asked about the field to the north of his farm building, the one with the odd depression in the middle. He had looked at her differently after that. "You noticed it," he said. "What causes it?" "Old well," he said. "Collapsed, probably before my time. I have been asking about it for years. Something heavy enough, it will take a leg clean off. A horse or a person." She had written it down. She had arranged for 2 of the groundskeepers to put temporary fencing around it within the week, and for Arthur Finch, who had by now become something close to the estate's unofficial maintenance man, to come and assess the proper repair in the spring. When she rode past Henry Bolt's farm 2 weeks later and he was mending a gate in the yard, he raised one hand to her. Not quite a wave, more of an acknowledgement. From Henry Bolt, she was already learning. That was considerable. She was learning people the same way she was learning the land, slowly, by showing up and paying attention, and not pretending to know things she did not. The village of Ashenvale-under-Moor had a population of perhaps 200 people, and Eleanor had made it her business to understand it. She attended the Sunday service at the church, which she would have done regardless, but which she made a point of doing with a consistency that people noticed. She made purchases at the market in Croydon once a week rather than sending the footman, because being seen and known was not the same thing as being talked about. She also attended a meeting of the local parish committee in early February, which nobody had expected, and which produced a full minute of silence when she walked in. The committee, 6 men and 2 women, ranging from the church warden to a farmer's wife named Dorothy Webb, had been discussing the matter of the road between the village and the Crowden Road, which had deteriorated badly. Eleanor listened to the full discussion before she said anything. Then she said that the road as it stood was also a problem for the estate's farm access, and that she was willing to contribute to its repair if the committee could organize the labor. The silence that followed this offer was of a different quality from the first one. Dorothy Webb, who turned out to have been the driving force behind the road discussion for 3 years, looked at Eleanor with an expression of careful, guarded hope. "We have been trying to get something done since the year before last," Dorothy said. "I know," Eleanor said. "I am sorry it has taken this long." She did not say that it had taken this long because nobody had been in charge at Ashenvale who was paying attention. She did not need to. Everyone in the room already knew it. The road repair was organized over the following month. Eleanor paid for the materials and coordinated with the groundskeepers, and the committee organized volunteers from the village for 2 Saturdays in early March, when the ground was firm enough. She went herself on both Saturdays, not to supervise but to work. She was not too proud to carry things, and the sight of the Duchess in a practical coat moving stone with the rest of them was apparently something people were going to be talking about for some time. She was told this by Mrs. Holt, who reported it with the ghost of something that might, in another person, have been a smile. Inside the castle, the East Wing rooms were now cleaned, aired, and no longer locked. She had moved the storeroom furniture into the 2 largest rooms and arranged it properly, not for any specific purpose yet, but because furniture in use was better than furniture stacked under sheets. The storeroom with the china had been inventoried. Some of the china was very fine indeed, and she had written to Edmund about it, suggesting that some pieces might be sold at auction in London if he had no objection. He had replied that he left such decisions to her judgment. She had written back, "Thank you." Then she had gone and sat in the library for a while and looked at the old woman's journal on the shelf and thought about what it meant to be trusted with someone's judgment as a gift rather than as a task. She was still working that out. Edmund's letters were coming more regularly now, still polite, still reserved, but more often. He had sent the book on agricultural improvement with a second letter adding some thoughts on the first chapter. He had asked, in passing, whether she had had any luck with the Crowden grain merchant. She had. The man's name was Peter Ward, and he was exactly as Edmund had described, sharp and willing to negotiate. And she had arranged a better contract for the estate's grain sales than the one that had been quietly running for 4 years on old terms. She told Edmund this. His reply included the sentence, "That is a better result than I would have expected. Well done." She read it 3 times, aware that she was doing so, aware that she was looking for warmth in words that were not quite warm, and then stopped reading it and put it in the drawer. The idea about the East Wing had been solidifying for weeks. She had not said it aloud to anyone yet because she wanted to be sure of it before she spoke, sure that it was right, sure that she could arrange it, and sure that she was doing it because it was good, and not because she wanted to be liked. The last was important. She had thought about it carefully. She did not want to confuse need with generosity. What she wanted to do was convert two of the large, light-filled east wing rooms into a schoolroom for the children of the estate and village. The nearest school was 6 miles away. The road, even improved, was not passable in hard winter for young children. The families on the estate had children who were intelligent and curious. She had seen it in the Warwick girl, in the two boys on Henry Bolt's farm who had both come quietly to her horse when she stopped and asked sensible questions about what she was looking at. These children were not learning to read well. Some were not learning to read at all. She sat with the numbers for a long time. A schoolroom needed a teacher, which was the significant cost. A teacher needed a salary and accommodation. The two smallest rooms at the end of the East Wing corridor could be a comfortable apartment. The salary was not nothing, but it was manageable. She had, by now, a clearer sense of what the estate could afford and what it could not, and a teacher's salary, while not small, was not impossible. She wrote to Edmund. This was the longest letter she had sent him. She laid out the proposal clearly: the rooms, the children, the teacher, the costs. She said she was not asking his permission so much as informing him of her intention, but that if he had any strong objection she was willing to discuss it. She said she thought it was the right thing to do, and that she thought it would matter to the people on the estate, and that mattering to those people seemed to her more important than the cost. She sealed it and sent it, and then she went to tell Mrs. Holt. Mrs. Holt listened to the whole proposal without speaking. Eleanor watched the housekeeper's face and tried to read it, and for a moment she thought she saw something cross behind the woman's eyes that might have been, of all things, real feeling. My own children had to walk 6 miles in winter, Mrs. Holt said at last. I know, Eleanor said, although she had not known. Not that specifically, that is why. There was a pause. Then Mrs. Holt said, the eastern rooms get good light until noon. If you put the desks facing the south windows, the children will have the best of it. She said it matter-of-factly, as if this had been settled between them. Eleanor took a breath. Then we will plan it that way. Edmund's reply arrived 10 days later. It was, of all the letters she had received from him, the longest and the least like the others. He wrote that he thought the schoolroom idea was an excellent one, and that he was glad she had proposed it. He wrote that he had some money set aside that was not accounted for in the estate income, a private reserve he had maintained without quite knowing what for, and that he would transfer it to the estate account for this purpose. The sum he named was enough to cover a teacher's salary for 3 years. She read that part of the letter 4 times. Then she wrote back, "Thank you, Edmund. I will make it count." She had not used his first name in any previous letter. She did not know if he would notice. She thought perhaps that he might. March brought mud and cold rain in the first green along the lower hedges. Eleanor continued her morning rides. Callie seemed to enjoy the lengthening days, walking with more life in her step as the light grew. The moor changed color slowly, not to anything dramatic, just from gray-brown to a gray that held a hint of green, the heather not yet showing but preparing underneath. She had begun to recognize individual features of the landscape the way you recognize a face you have seen enough times. She knew where the track bent left past the old boundary stone. She knew where the skylarks nested in the rough grass near the second farm field. She knew the sound the wind made when it came from the north against the castle's east face, different from all other directions, lower and steadier. She realized one morning, sitting on Callie on the rise above the village with the early light stretching over the moor, beginning to love this place. Not the castle, not the name, the place itself. The sky and the stone and the brown water that ran over the pebbles at the edge of the moor. She had not expected that. She was not sure she had a right to it, this love for a place she had arrived at by arrangement rather than by choice. But she was here, and it was beginning to be hers. She turned Callie toward the castle and rode back at a gentle pace, her breath making small white clouds in the morning air. And behind her the village woke up in the ordinary way that villages do. Smoke from chimneys, a dog barking, the sound of a gate swinging on its hinge. She unsaddled Callie herself and brushed her down before going in for breakfast. William, the footman, had noticed this habit early on, and had stopped trying to intervene, which she was grateful for. At breakfast, there was a letter. She opened it thinking it was from her father, but the handwriting was unfamiliar, careful and neat. It was from Edmund's land agent in London, a man she had not yet been in contact with, informing her that the Duke had instructed him to assist her with whatever she required regarding the estate. She sat with the letter for a while, eating her toast. She thought, he is moving closer, in the only way available to him, from a great distance, through letters and agents and the quiet direction of money toward things she is doing. She thought, that is something. That is not nothing. She wrote a reply to the land agent with 3 specific questions she had been meaning to ask someone in London. Then she wrote in her journal, he sent help. I do not know what to do with that yet, but I am going to think about it. What I do know is that it changes nothing and it changes everything, simultaneously, and I will need to be careful about which of those things I pay attention to. She closed the journal. She went to the east wing to measure the 2 largest rooms properly, because the schoolroom was going to need desks, and desks needed to be built to the right size, and the children's comfort mattered more than any of the rest of it. She measured twice and wrote the numbers in her notebook in her clear small hand, and outside the rain fell on the new tiles of the east wing roof and ran cleanly into the gutters and off the stone and down to the ground, which was exactly what rain was supposed to do. The schoolroom opened on the 5th of April, on a morning when the rain had stopped overnight, and the light was the particular clean brightness that only comes after a long wet spell. There were 14 children. Eleanor had expected 8 or 10. She had counted the families and their ages carefully, but word had reached beyond the estate, and 3 families from the village had asked, quietly, through Dorothy Webb, whether their children might attend. Eleanor had said yes before Dorothy finished asking. The teacher's name was Frances Lee. She was 32, the daughter of a schoolmaster in the east of England, and she had been teaching in a village school near Sheffield for 6 years when the advertisement reached her. Eleanor had written the advertisement herself, specifying clear teaching, patience, and the capacity to teach children of varying ages in one room. She had received 7 replies and had read them all carefully, and had chosen Frances Lee because her letter was the only one that began not with a description of her qualifications, but with a question. What do you want these children to be able to do when they leave you? Eleanor had written back, I want them to be able to read anything. I want them to be able to write what they think. I want them to understand numbers well enough that they are never cheated. She had added, I want them to know that their minds matter. Frances Lee had replied, I will take the position. She arrived 2 weeks before the opening, which was exactly what Eleanor had hoped for. She was a compact, observant woman with a direct manner and a habit of assessing a room very quickly upon entering it. She assessed Eleanor with the same efficiency and, Eleanor thought, reached some conclusion she kept to herself. They had gotten along almost immediately, in the careful way that 2 practical women who respect each other's competence get along when there is too much work to allow for more than that. The desks had been built by a carpenter in Crowden, 12 of them, child-sized, arranged in 2 rows facing the south windows as Mrs. Holt had suggested. There was a large board at the front and a smaller desk for Frances, and a shelf of books along one wall that Eleanor had selected from the library and supplemented with 20 new purchases from a bookseller in London. On the morning the children arrived, Eleanor stood in the doorway of the East Wing corridor and watched them come up the drive with their families. The Warwick girl, her name was Ruth, Eleanor had learned, was first through the gate, walking fast, her little brother almost running to keep up. George Parr's grandson, a boy of 6 named Alfred, held his grandmother's hand and looked at the castle with enormous eyes. Henry Bolt's granddaughter, who was 8, and whose name was Clara, the same name as Eleanor's maid, which she found quietly pleasing, walked with the settled purpose of a child who has decided she is going to take this seriously. Frances received them at the schoolroom door. Eleanor stayed in the corridor and did not go in. This was Frances's room. It would work better if the children understood that from the beginning. She went to her study and tried to read the account books. She could not quite concentrate. She went to the window instead and stood there, and somewhere above her, through the ceiling and the floor and the stone, 14 children were sitting down to learn. She felt something in her chest that she did not have a name for. It was not pride. It was too mixed with sadness to be only that. It was the particular feeling of having done something that mattered, in a way that would outlast the moment. She held it carefully, that feeling, and did not try to name it further. The months that followed were the most productive Eleanor had ever known. The schoolroom ran every weekday morning and some afternoons. Frances proved to be not only a good teacher but an excellent observer of the community. She reported to Eleanor, over their weekly tea on Fridays, things she learned from the children that added to Eleanor's picture of what the estate and village needed. One child had a persistent cough that suggested the damp in the cottage was worse than the repairs had addressed. Another was clearly hungry before noon in a way that the morning lessons could not accommodate. A third was extraordinarily good at figures and had been helping her farmer father keep accounts since the age of 7. Eleanor addressed each of these things methodically. The cottage was re-examined and additional work done. She arranged with Mrs. Bray that a simple mid-morning meal, bread and a hot drink, would be available at the castle kitchen for any child who needed it, to be fetched quietly by Frances without fuss or ceremony. The boy who was good at figures, whose name was Owen and who was 10, was given a set of proper arithmetic books and told, through Frances, that he might use the library on Saturday afternoons if he wished. Owen came the following Saturday and every Saturday thereafter. He sat at the library table with his books and his careful work and said very little. But he ate the biscuits that William quietly left on a plate near his chair, and he always thanked Eleanor when she passed through, with a gravity that was entirely without performance. Summer came. The days lengthened until it was light, until 9 in the evening, and the moor turned from gray-green to the deep purple of heather in full bloom. Eleanor rode further now, sometimes to the edge of the estate where the moorland proper began, where the ground changed character and the wind came unobstructed for miles. She had begun, in these long evenings, to understand the shooting lease question properly. The moorland had not been managed for grouse for years, which meant the habitat had partly reverted. It was recoverable. She had read enough to know that. But it would take consistent work and time before it could support a proper shoot. That investment of time and work would require someone to manage it, which would be another salary. Against that had to be set the potential income from a revived lease, which, looking at what comparable moors were earning in the region, could be substantial. She wrote all of this to Edmund. It was one of her longer letters, 3 pages, with figures. She said she was not recommending they proceed immediately, but that she wanted him to have the full picture. His reply came back in 10 days, faster than usual. He had clearly read everything carefully because he addressed each point in sequence, which was not how he normally wrote. He agreed with her analysis. He thought the timeline was realistic. He added, "I should mention that I know the man who currently leases the Blackmere Moor. I could write to him if you wish, as a starting point for understanding how such arrangements are currently structured. Please tell me if this would be useful." Eleanor put down the letter and looked at the wall. He had offered to do something. He had offered to help, specifically, with something that required him to draw on his own knowledge and connections. She wrote back the same afternoon, "Yes, that would be very useful. Thank you." The summer also brought a visitor. Eleanor's father came north in July for a week, the first family Eleanor had received at Ashenvale. She met his carriage at the door and felt, as he climbed down and looked up at the castle, what it was like to see it through fresh eyes, the towers, the gray stone, the scale of it against the summer sky. He said nothing for a moment, then he looked at her. "You look well," he said. He said it with particular care, the way he said things when he meant more than the words contained. "I am well," she said, and it was true. She showed him everything. The East Wing rooms, the schoolroom. He sat in the back for half an hour one morning while Frances taught and came away quiet and thoughtful. She showed him the repaired cottages, the mended road, the kitchen garden where the south-facing wall had produced, as the old journal had promised, something rather extraordinary in the way of strawberries. She showed him the journal. She found she wanted him to see it, this other woman, 100 years ago, who had come to the same place by a not entirely different road, and had made something of it. Her father read several pages standing at the library table. Then he closed it carefully, and looked at Eleanor over his spectacles. She knew what she was doing, he said. "Yes," Eleanor said. "Like someone else I know." She did not answer that, but she let it sit. On his last evening they sat by the fire after dinner. The dining room was much more comfortable now, the good rugs brought out of storage, the table properly set with the better china, and her father asked her, in the gentle, indirect way he had when he was asking something that mattered, "Are you content?" She thought about the question properly, not the quick answer but the honest one. "I am not sure content is the right word," she said, "but I am building something, and I think it is worth building." Her father nodded slowly. "And the Duke? He writes," she said. "What does he say?" She paused, more than he used to. Her father looked into the fire. "Is that enough?" She looked at the fire too. "I do not know yet," she said. He left in the morning. She stood on the drive and watched his carriage go, and then stood for a moment in the morning quiet, the heather on the moor at its deepest purple, the castle solid and certain behind her, and she thought, she was not lonely. She had been lonely for months when she arrived. That had quietly changed. She was not sure when. Autumn came, and with it the harvest. The farm yields were better than the previous year. Not dramatically, but measurably, which was enough. Eleanor had worked through the summer with the farmers on a few specific things. A field that had been badly managed and which, with different seeding, had produced better. A question of timing with the hay that George Parr had raised and which, on investigation, he had been right about. She was also, by autumn, corresponding with a woman she had met through the parish committee, a woman named Catherine Morse, who lived in Crowden and who ran, with her husband, a small operation selling goods from local farms to markets in the larger towns further south. Catherine had approached Eleanor about the kitchen garden produce, and the conversation had expanded. By October they had a modest but working arrangement for the castle's surplus. Eleanor wrote to Edmund about it. She framed it as she usually did. Facts, figures, clear language. But she added at the end, almost without planning to, I find that the work here is becoming a conversation rather than a solitary project. There are people to think with. I did not expect that, when I came." She almost removed the last sentence. It felt more personal than she usually allowed herself in his direction. But she left it in. His reply, when it came, was the one she would think about longest. He wrote the practical things first, as always. Then, at the very end, he wrote, "I think I understand what you mean about the conversation. I have found it difficult, in the years I have been away, to have that. Everything here is temporary. People move on. What you are describing sounds like roots, and I am glad you have found them. I did not expect you to find them so well." She read that last part very slowly. She read it the way you read something when you are trying to understand whether the person who wrote it knew what they were saying. She thought that he had known. She set the letter in the drawer with the others. There were 14 of them now, a small stack that had grown without her quite noticing, and went to her window. The moor was going dark early now, the way it did in autumn, the light failing before 5 and the castle taking on its night weight of stone and shadow. In the schoolroom above her, she could hear the faint sound of Francis moving chairs back into position after the day's lessons, the regular click and scrape of it. Outside, in the lane, she could see Ruth Warwick and her brother walking home, Ruth carrying a book that Francis had lent her, holding it inside her coat to keep it dry from the evening drizzle. The girl noticed Eleanor at the window. She raised a hand. Eleanor raised hers. It was such a small thing, a wave between a child and a woman at a window in the early dark. But it contained, Eleanor thought, almost everything that mattered. It was the sign of a place that knew her. It was the sign of a place that was, in whatever imperfect and incomplete way, beginning to be home. She turned back to her desk and took out her journal. She had been keeping it faithfully, every evening, since the first night. It was nearly full. She had a second one waiting in the drawer. She opened to that evening's page and wrote the date, and then she wrote, "Autumn, year 2. Things are growing. Some of it is visible, like the farms. Some of it is not, like the thing that happens when a child waves at you and you understand that she knows your face." She paused. Then she wrote, "I think I will be all right here. I think, in fact, that I already am." The shift in Edmund's letters happened slowly, and Eleanor noticed it the way you notice a change in weather, not a single moment, but a series of small signs that, taken together, tell you something has moved. It began with a question, not a practical question. He had asked those before, about the grain contract or the roof or the land agent. This was different. In a letter sent from Munich in the January of Eleanor's 3rd year at Ashenvale, he wrote, "You mentioned some weeks ago that one of the children at the school was particularly gifted with numbers. Has that continued to develop? I found myself thinking about it." She read the sentence 3 times. He had been thinking about Owen. He had been thinking about something she had mentioned, not because it affected the estate's finances, but because he had been, quietly, paying attention. She wrote back a full paragraph about Owen. She described the Saturday afternoons in the library, the arithmetic books, the particular way the boy had of sitting very still when he was working through a difficult problem, as if the problem needed his absolute silence to solve itself. She mentioned that Francis thought Owen might, if the opportunity arose, be capable of scholarship of some kind. Edmund wrote back, "That would be worth pursuing. There are men I know in Edinburgh who might be approached on the question of academic support for promising children of limited means. I will think about it." And he did. 3 weeks later he wrote with a name, a professor at Edinburgh who ran a small committee that provided support to academically gifted children who could not otherwise access education. He wrote the professor's full name and the committee's address, and suggested that Francis might write directly. Francis wrote. The committee wrote back. Owen, who was now 12, did not know any of this was happening. He came to the library every Saturday and worked through his books and ate the biscuits William left, and thanked Eleanor with his solemn gravity, which had deepened into a 12-year-old gravity that was somehow both funnier and more moving. When Francis told him, on a Saturday in March, that there was a scholarship possibility for the following year, the boy was quiet for so long that Francis came to find Eleanor because she was worried she had said something wrong. Eleanor came to the library. Owen was sitting at the table with his hands flat on the arithmetic book, looking at the wall. "Owen," Eleanor said. He looked at her. His eyes were wet, which he was clearly mortified by, and he was not going to say anything about it. "It is not certain yet," she said, "but it is possible, and possible is worth working toward." He nodded. He looked back at the book. Then he picked up his pencil and continued where he had left off. Eleanor went back to her study and wrote to Edmund. "Your Edinburgh contact has produced something real. The boy is sitting in the library right now, working harder than ever. I thought you should know that." His reply, "I am glad. I do not quite know why I thought of it, but I am glad I did." She held that sentence for a while. She thought about the man who had stood in the church doorway with the expression of someone completing a formality and then gotten on a train. She thought about the distance between that man and the man who was writing to her from Munich about a 12-year-old boy's scholarship possibilities. She was not sure the distance was as great as it looked. She was beginning to think that the apparent coldness she had first seen in Edmund was not coldness at all, but a kind of profound shyness that had hardened into habit over years. He was a man who felt things and had no reliable way to say them, and so he expressed them at a distance, through action rather than speech, through the Edinburgh contact, through the agricultural book sent with no note, through the money for the schoolroom teacher. She was not sure what to do with this understanding. She filed it carefully. The letters continued. His were now, on average, twice as long as they had been in year one. He had begun to write about the places he was in, not as travel reports exactly, but with the detail of someone who was finally noticing things because he was in the habit of noticing things in his letters to her. He wrote about a market in Vienna where he had seen a vegetable he could not identify and had asked a woman selling it, and she had spoken no English, and he had spoken no German, and they had arrived at mutual understanding through gestures. He wrote this as a paragraph, almost as an aside, but it was the most personal thing he had written her in 3 years of correspondence. She wrote back about the heather. She described it in bloom, the specific purple of it in August, the smell of it, the way it changed the whole quality of the light on the moor. She found, as she was writing it, that she was writing about the place the way she would write about something she loved, and this surprised her slightly, and she let it surprise her without editing the letter. In the spring of year 3, a box arrived. It had been sent from Paris, and it contained 7 books. Not one book, as before, but 7. They were all different. One was about the history of estates in the northern English counties. One was about European agricultural reform in the 18th century. One was a novel that she gathered was currently being widely read in London. One was a collection of poetry, and the other 3 were on subjects that ranged across history and natural science. There was no note in the box. She laid them all out on her desk. She looked at them for a long time. 7 books. He had thought about her enough, specifically enough, to choose 7 different books for 7 different aspects of what he understood about her mind. There was no other explanation for a selection this varied and this precise. She picked up the poetry collection and opened it. It fell open near the middle, to a page where the corner had been turned down very slightly, barely noticeable, the kind of thing you might miss. She looked at the poem on that page. It was about a garden in winter. It was about the way things that seemed to have stopped are not stopped, only resting. It was a quiet poem, not dramatic, the kind of poem that stays with you. She did not write to him about the folded corner. She did not write about the poem. She wrote about the novel and the history of northern estates, asking him questions, because those were safe and because she wanted to hear what he thought. But she kept the book with the folded corner on her bedside table. Winter passed into spring with a reliability that she was beginning to find actively comforting. The seasons at Ashenvale were more distinct than anywhere she had lived before, more certain, more full of their own character. The spring here was not gentle, it was sudden and forceful, the ground unlocking overnight into something soft, the birds arriving loud and immediate, the moor turning fast from winter to something that promised. Eleanor loved it. She loved it with a specific and personal love that surprised her every year. How strong it was. She found the portrait of Edmund in the attic on a Tuesday in March, when she was looking for something else entirely. She had been trying to locate a set of old household inventories that Mrs. Holt thought might be in storage on the upper floor. She found those too, eventually. But she found the portrait first. It was propped against the wall behind a stack of old frames, covered in a piece of velvet that had slipped sideways. She moved the velvet. He was younger in it, perhaps 25, in evening dress, in front of a window that she did not recognize as being in this castle. He was not smiling in the way formal portraits sometimes demand, which she respected. His eyes looked directly out of the canvas with an expression she had not seen on his face in person, because she had not seen his face long enough or closely enough to find it. The expression was serious but not cold. It was, she thought, the face of a man who was paying attention. She carried the portrait downstairs and leaned it against the wall of her study, facing her desk. She told herself she was doing this because it was relevant. She was managing his estate. She ought to know his face. She told herself that for about a week before she stopped bothering to explain it to herself. She had been writing to him for 3 years. She knew his handwriting intimately. She knew the rhythm of his sentences and the particular words he used, and which subjects made him write more than others. She knew he was more comfortable with practical matters, but that he was increasingly willing to stray into the personal, slowly, the way you test unfamiliar ground. One step forward, then pause. She knew that he was alone in the cities he moved through, and that he was aware of being alone. even if he did not say so. She knew that something had driven him away from England and from Ashenvale 3 years ago, something she still did not fully understand. She knew his face now, in the way you know a face from a painting, not fully, but in outline, the gray eyes, the contained expression, the way the painter had caught the quality of his attention without making it theatrical. She wrote to him in April, "I found a portrait of you in the attic. I hope you do not mind that I have brought it downstairs. It seemed wrong to leave it up there." She waited to see what he would say to that. His reply came back in 2 weeks. He wrote about other things first. There was news about the Moreland shooting inquiry. There was a development with the Edinburgh Committee regarding Owen. There was a question about the kitchen garden. Then, at the very end, in a sentence that she suspected had been added and removed and re-added before the letter was sealed, "I do not mind about the portrait. I always thought it was a poor likeness, though I suppose I am not the best judge." She wrote back, "I think it is a good likeness. His eyes are right." She was not sure what she meant by that entirely, but she sent it. His next letter took 3 weeks to arrive, which was longer than usual, and when it came it did not address the portrait at all. She wondered if she had gone too far. Then she read the letter properly and found, in the middle of his report on the conversation with the Edinburgh professor, a sentence that had nothing to do with Owen. "I find that I think of Ashenvale more than I expected to. Or rather, I think of what you have described in your letters. I find that the place as you describe it is easier to picture than the place I left, which is strange, considering I spent 30 years there and have known it all my life." She sat with that for a long time. She went to the window and looked at the moor, which was beginning, in its slow, careful way, to move toward summer. She thought about what it meant that the place she had built, in letters, in small daily choices, in the steady work of 3 years, was more real to him than the place he had known from birth. She thought, "I have made something he cannot see yet, and he knows it, and he cannot quite leave it alone." She went back to the desk and she wrote, "When you think of it, what do you see?" She wrote it quickly, before she could talk herself out of it. She posted the letter. She went to the schoolroom and listened to Francis teaching the children the names of the countries of Europe, pointing to a map on the wall, and the children calling the names back to her with the cheerful confidence of children learning something that has not yet become difficult. She stood in the doorway and watched and thought that she had built this too. This specific happiness, on this specific afternoon, in this room that had been sealed for years. Edmund's reply to her question about what he saw when he thought of Ashenvale took nearly a month. It was the longest letter he had ever sent. It was 4 pages, in his careful, measured handwriting, and it began not with practical matters, for the first time in their entire correspondence. He wrote about the sound of the wind on the east face of the castle, which she had mentioned once and which had apparently stayed with him. He wrote about the lime trees in winter, which he had known from childhood and which he described with a specific accuracy that told her the trees were something he thought about. He wrote about the view from the South Tower, which she had not been to. She had not known there was accessible access, and which he described as the only place in his experience where you could see the whole of the moor and the village and the farmland at once. Everything together, a single picture. He wrote, "I used to go there as a child when I needed to think. I have been wondering lately whether it is still accessible, and if so, whether you have found it." She had not. She went that afternoon. She found the stair at the back of the south wing behind a door she had assumed was a storage cupboard. The stairs were steep and dusty and entirely sound. She climbed them and came out onto the tower platform and stopped. He was right. It was the whole estate at once. Every field, every farm, the village rooftops, the moor spreading north and west until it met the sky. She could see Henry Bolt's farm in the distance and closer, a white shape that was probably one of the Warwick sheep, and the road she had helped repair, and the schoolroom windows in the east wing. She could see all of it. She stood there for a long time in the spring wind. Then she went down and wrote to Edmund, "I found it. You were right about it entirely. I stood there for 20 minutes and could not quite believe it was all there at once." She added, "I went back the next morning too, early, before anyone was awake. The heather was just catching the light. I thought of you, which is something I am telling you because I think you should know." She had never said anything like that to him before. She sealed the letter fast, before she could think about it, and gave it to Clara to post without looking at it again. She went to bed that night and lay awake for a while and then thought, he will either answer that or he will not. Either way, something has shifted. And she found, to her quiet surprise, that she was not afraid of the shift, only curious. Only very carefully, quietly curious. By the autumn of Eleanor's 5th year at Ashenvale, the great hall held the harvest supper and it was full. Full in a way it had clearly not been for years, perhaps decades, though Eleanor had no way of knowing for certain how long the tradition had lapsed. Mrs. Holt, who was not given to sentiment, had told her when Eleanor proposed reviving it, that she had last attended a harvest supper in the great hall as a young woman, which put it at 30 years ago at least. Eleanor had organized it over 2 months. The tables came from storage in the east wing, the long trestle tables that had been stacked against the wall, covered in dust that when cleaned revealed good solid oak. Mrs. Bray had been planning the food since August, consulting with Dorothy Webb from the parish committee, and with 2 of the farmers' wives about what should be served. The result, on the November evening that 43 people sat down in the great hall of Ashenvale Castle, was a table that ran the full length of the room and carried more food than Eleanor could name, and fires burning in the 2 hearths that drew correctly, because the flues had been cleared, and she would never again take a properly drawing fire for granted. She sat at the head of the table. Her chair was the one that had always been there, the carved chair at the head, which she had thought, when she first found it under its cover, was far too substantial for a woman alone. She sat in it now and looked down the length of the table at 42 people eating and talking and, in several cases, laughing, and she thought, this is what a great hall is for. This is what the people who built it were thinking of. Ruth Warwick was there with her family. Owen was there, reserved as always, but eating with the appetite of a 12-year-old who has been promised good food. George Parr and his wife Nell had come, and Nell had brought a jar of preserved plums that she pressed into Eleanor's hands on the way in, with the expression of a woman who has decided that this is the appropriate response to a roof repaired and a promise kept. Henry Bolt sat near the far end and ate steadily, and twice laughed at something the man next to him said, which was enough to make Eleanor feel that something real had been achieved. Francis Lee sat halfway down the table, talking with Catherine Morse, and the 2 of them had clearly discovered some shared enthusiasm, because they were both leaning forward in that way people do when the conversation has arrived somewhere good. After supper, a man named Geoffrey Rowe who played the fiddle did so for 2 hours, and some people danced and others watched, and everyone stayed later than Eleanor had planned for. She stood in the doorway of the great hall at 10 o'clock and watched the room, and felt the particular feeling she had no name for, the one that had visited her the day the schoolroom opened, quieter than happiness, deeper and steadier. She wrote to Edmund that night. She wrote it quickly and did not revise it. She described the supper, the tables, the fires, Mrs. Bray's roasted parsnips, which had been unexpectedly the dish everyone discussed, Geoffrey Rowe's fiddle, the sound of 40 people in the great hall that had been silent for decades. She wrote, I stood in the doorway at 10 o'clock and it felt, for the first time, like the house was doing what a house is supposed to do, not just standing, living. She sealed it and went to bed, and slept the deep sleep of someone who has been carrying something heavy for a long time, and has finally set it down. His reply, when it came, was 1 sentence longer than she expected, and the last sentence was, I should have done this. I understand that now. I am glad you did instead. She read that sentence until she had it by memory. Then she filed it with the others. The 5th year was also the year that the moorland question was finally resolved. The inquiry Edmund had initiated through his London contact had moved slowly through the previous 2 years. The right person had to be found. The terms had to be agreed. The condition of the habitat had to be assessed by someone who understood grouse moors properly. By the spring of year 5, a man named Robert Fenn had come up from Yorkshire, spent 4 days on the moor with 2 of the groundskeepers, and produced a report that Eleanor read carefully and then read again. The moor was recoverable, as she had thought. The habitat work would take 2 full years before any lease could begin, but the potential income, if the work was done properly, was substantial, enough to fund the kind of maintenance the castle and estate needed not just for 1 year but sustainably, going forward. The report also noted that the moor was, in several areas, particularly beautiful, which was not a professional observation, but which Eleanor noted with private pleasure. She wrote to Edmund with the full summary. He wrote back within 10 days, fast for him, saying he thought they should proceed and asking her to engage Fenn to supervise the habitat work. He added that he would write to the London contact who had introduced them, to confirm. This was the most actively he had been involved in an estate decision since before they were married. Eleanor wrote, Thank you. I will contact Fenn this week. This is going to take the estate somewhere it should have been years ago. She meant it practically. She also meant something else by it, something about the 2 of them learning to work together at a distance, but she let the practical meaning stand on its own. The kitchen garden that year was the best it had been. Eleanor had been working on it for 3 years, soil improvement, better planning, proper rotation, and in the 5th summer it produced strawberries from the south-facing bed that she ate standing in the garden on a July morning, and which were exactly as the old journal had promised. She went inside and got the journal from the library shelf and read that entry again, and then stood with it open in her hands for a while, in the warm morning sun. She thought about the woman who had written it. She thought about the 100 years between them and the things that had stayed the same, the south wall, the soil, the particular warmth that the stone held and released. She thought, "We never met and we never will, and you left me something invaluable, which is the knowledge that this place rewards patience." She put the journal back and went to find Mrs. Holt to tell her that the strawberry bed needed expanding for next year. Mrs. Holt, by the 5th year, was no longer the carefully reserved woman who had stood at the door on Eleanor's first day assessing the new Duchess with polite suspicion. She was not warm in the conventional sense. She was too precise, too controlled for warmth as most people meant it. But she had become something more specific and, Eleanor thought, more valuable. She was Eleanor's most reliable ally in the running of the house, and she was honest, in a way that required courage, because she told Eleanor when something was not working, with the same directness she used to report things that were. She had also, in the 5th year, told Eleanor something she had never told her before. They were going over the November household accounts together one evening when Mrs. Holt said, without looking up from the ledger, "I have been here 22 years. I stayed through the years when nobody was here and things were bad. I am glad I did." Eleanor looked at her. "I am glad you did too," she said. "The house was never like this," Mrs. Holt said. "Not in my time." She paused. "I do not say that lightly, Your Grace." Eleanor said nothing. She looked back at the ledger. After a moment she said, "Can we increase Harriet's wages? She is doing the work of 2 people and she is good enough for a better position, but I would rather she stayed here." "Yes," said Mrs. Holt. "I had been going to raise that myself." The year also brought Owen's scholarship result. The letter from Edinburgh arrived in October, addressed to Francis, who brought it directly to Eleanor. They opened it together in the study. Owen had been accepted for the following year, with full support for tuition and a small living allowance. Francis read the letter twice, then looked at Eleanor, with an expression that Eleanor met with one she hoped conveyed the same thing. They went to tell Owen. He was in the library. Of course he was in the library, working on something, his head bent low over a page. Francis told him. He looked up. He looked at the letter. He looked at Eleanor. "Edinburgh," he said, as if testing the word to see if it was real. "Edinburgh," Eleanor confirmed. He nodded very slowly. Then he looked back at the page. He was not going to let himself cry about good news, she could see. He was 12 and had decided that was no longer something he did. But the pencil in his hand was not entirely steady. She left him in the library. Some things needed to be felt privately. She wrote to Edmund that evening. The Edinburgh letter came. "It is yes." That was the entire letter, which was unlike her. But she thought he would understand. He wrote back 3 days later, a full letter. But the first sentence was, "I have been waiting to hear. I am very glad." She put that letter in the drawer and stood at the window for a while. She had been thinking about Edmund differently since the letters had changed. She was careful with this. She was not going to construct a man out of correspondence and then be unprepared for the reality. She had done enough reading and enough living to know that a person in letters and a person in a room are never quite the same person, and that what she felt for the man in the letters might have to be revised when she met the man in the room. She did not know when she would meet the man in the room. He had not mentioned returning. She did not ask. She had come to think of the distance between them as something with its own character, neither entirely absence nor exactly presence, but something in between, a space in which they had, against all probability, built something. She had built Ashenvale. That was entirely true, and she held it without apology. She had arrived with a key and a title, and nothing else, and she had made a home from those materials, and the making of it had made her. But the correspondence had made something too. She was not sure yet what to call it. She only knew that the drawer of letters was now quite full, and that she did not want to stop. In November, a journalist from a farming publication in Leeds wrote to the estate asking if they might speak with the Duchess about the agricultural improvements that had come to their attention. The land agent in London had forwarded the request. Eleanor read it twice, then wrote back saying she was happy to speak with them but would prefer they come to Ashenvale and see the work in person rather than discussing it at a distance. They came, 2 of them, a man named Walter Hughes who wrote the agricultural column and a younger man who took notes. They spent 2 days on the estate. They talked to the farmers. They visited the schoolroom. They walked the moorland with the groundskeepers. They had supper at the castle, and Eleanor told them what she had done and, more importantly, why, which was the harder thing to explain. Walter Hughes was a good journalist. He asked good questions. One of them was, "When you arrived here, Your Grace, what did you find?" She thought about that for a moment. "I found potential," she said, "and I found that nobody had been there to develop it. So I developed it." "You did this largely on your own, I understand, with the Duke abroad." "Yes," she said. "Was that difficult?" She looked at him steadily. "It was the best thing that happened to me," she said, "not because he was gone, but because the responsibility was entirely mine. I had to learn everything, and learning everything was the making of me. Hughes wrote the piece in December. It was published in January of the following year and was well received in the farming community in the north of England. A copy was sent to the estate. Eleanor read it and found it accurate and generous. She folded it and put it in the drawer with Edmund's letters. She did not tell Edmund about it immediately. She was not sure why. Perhaps because the article belonged to her, to the 5 years of her work, which were hers alone and which she was not yet ready to share in that particular way. But she thought about what Edmund would say when he read it. She thought he would not be surprised. She thought he would be pleased in the precise, considered way that he was pleased by things. Not effusive, but real. She was looking forward to the conversation, she realized. The actual spoken conversation, eventually, in an actual room. She had not let herself look forward to it before. Now she did. She held the thought carefully. The way you hold something you are not sure yet belongs to you. Outside, the first snow of winter came down slow and steady on the moor, and the castle was warm. Entirely warm. Every fire drawing, every chimney clear, every room that was supposed to be used being used. The schoolroom was quiet for the winter break, but when Eleanor walked past it in the evening she could hear, in the silence, the presence of children who had been there every morning for nearly 2 years, leaving the particular kind of mark that human life leaves in rooms where it has been regular and purposeful and real. She put her hand against the door for a moment. Then she went to write her evening letter. The letter was heavier than usual. Eleanor felt it the moment Clara set the Morning Post on the tray. Not its physical weight, which was the same as always, but something in the quality of the envelope, the way the folded pages inside created a different kind of resistance when she pressed it gently between her fingers before opening it. She set the others aside and opened this one first, which was something she never did with Edmund's letters because she had learned to save them for when she had time to read properly. She read it at the breakfast table with her tea cooling beside her. He was returning to England. Not in the same way he might have said it a year ago, briefly, practically, as information to be passed on. He wrote 2 pages about it. He wrote that he had been thinking about it for several months. He wrote that the years abroad had given him something he found difficult to name. Distance, he said, from himself, which was the only way he could describe it, and which he acknowledged was a strange thing to need. He wrote that he thought that distance had perhaps been necessary, but that he also thought it had gone on too long. He wrote that he did not know quite what to expect when he returned. He wrote that Ashenvale, as she had made it, was not a place he recognized entirely from his own memories, and that he thought this was a good thing, though it would take some adjustment. Then he wrote, "I would like to come home, if that is still possible. I recognize that I am asking something that requires more than simple logistics." She put the letter down and looked at the window. The January sky outside was white and close, full of the kind of weather that could not decide whether it wanted to snow. The moor beyond the garden was the color of old paper. He was asking her something. He was asking if there was room for him. She thought about that carefully. She sat with it at the breakfast table for long enough that Clara came back to refill the teapot and took one look at her face and left again without speaking, which was one of the many reasons Eleanor valued Clara above almost anyone. Was there room? The honest answer was, she did not know. She knew there was room in the castle. The house was large enough for a battalion, let alone 2 people. She knew there was room in the estate's management for him, if he wanted to be involved. What she did not know, what she could not know from letters alone, was whether there was room in the particular life she had built, which was not just an estate, but a set of relationships, a set of habits, a way of being in this place that had become entirely natural to her, for a person she had never actually lived with. She thought about this all morning. She went to her study and tried to work and could not, quite. She went to the library instead and sat in the chair by the window for a long time. She thought about who she had been when she arrived. The young woman with the iron key and a title that felt like a stranger's clothing. She thought about who she was now. The distance between those 2 people was 5 years and 43 harvest supper guests and a schoolroom full of children and a drawer full of letters from a man she had come to know in the only way available to her. She was not afraid of his return. She had checked herself for fear and found that it was not exactly that. It was something more like the feeling before a significant event, not dreading it but aware of it. Aware that whatever came next would be different from what had come before. She went back to her desk and she wrote. She told him she was glad he was coming back. She told him the south wing was habitable. She had kept it maintained, because that was simply good sense, and the rooms were sound and comfortable. She told him that she was glad he had said that returning was something he wanted, rather than something he was simply doing, because the wanting mattered. Then she wrote the harder thing, which was, "I should tell you that this house is not how you left it. It is not how I found it either. It has become something else over these years, and the something else is mine, which is not a claim against you but a fact you should know before you arrive. I have made it a home. It is my home. I hope it can be yours too. But I want to be honest with you about what you are coming back to, which is not quite the Ashenvale you left. She sealed it and sent it, and then, for the first time in 5 years, she went up to the South Tower and stood there for a long time looking at the estate. She saw everything from there, all the work, all the years, spread out below her in the winter fields, the repaired cottages, the straight new section of road, the east wing with its windows full of light even on a gray day, the schoolroom running, the kitchen garden under its winter covering, already planned for spring, the groundskeeper's work on the moorland visible in the careful grid of new heather plantings that would, in 2 more years, be the beginning of the proper habitat they needed. She saw it all and she thought, I made this. Not alone. She had never been alone in the making of it, not really. Not after those early months. She had made it with Mrs. Holt and Mrs. Bray and Francis and George Parr and Henry Bolt and Dorothy Webb and Catherine Morse and Arthur Finch and Owen and Ruth and Clara and William and all the others, the gradual accumulation of people who had decided to show up. She had made it with Edmund too, in his way, with his letters and his Edinburgh contact and his agricultural books and his quiet direction of money toward things she was doing. She had not done it alone, but she had been the one who was here. She turned and looked north, where the moor went on, and she thought about Edmund on a train somewhere in Europe moving toward this, moving toward the thing she had built. She tried to imagine his face when he first came up the drive, saw the lime trees that she had pruned and shaped over 5 years into a proper avenue, saw the east wing windows full of good glass, saw the kitchen garden wall and the repaired gate and all the 100 small evidences of 5 years of attention. She could not quite imagine it. She knew his face from the portrait and from her own long looking at it, but a face responding to something real was different from a face in a painting. She would have to see it. She went downstairs and found Mrs. Holt in the corridor. The Duke is returning, she said, before the winter is out, I think, though he has not given a date. Mrs. Holt received this with the particular stillness she reserved for significant news. A pause. Then, I will have the south wing properly aired. Thank you, said Eleanor. She went to her study and sat down and opened her journal. She had filled 7 journals by now. This one was half full. She turned to the day's page and wrote, or, he is coming back. She underlined it once, not dramatically, just firmly. Then she wrote underneath, I do not know what it means yet. I do not know what we are to each other except letters and distance and a strange, slow understanding. I do not know if the man who comes through the door will be the man I have come to know through paper. She paused, then she wrote, but I am not the woman who arrived at this door 5 years ago, and he will have to meet that too. Edmund's reply to her letter came in 2 weeks. He wrote, you are right that I am coming to something new. I have known for some time that what you described in your letters was not what I left. I have been glad of the knowing, and I should tell you, though this may sound strange, that learning this place through your descriptions over 5 years has made it easier to come back to, not harder. You have given it back to me in a form I can understand. That is not a small thing. He added, after a paragraph about practical arrangements, I should also tell you that what you said about the house being yours, I am glad you said it. I would rather know the truth plainly. I have had enough of things left unsaid. She held that last sentence for a long time. He would arrive, he said, in early February. His exact date of departure from Vienna was still unclear, but he would write when he knew. He would give her at least a week's notice. He gave her 9 days. The letter came on a Thursday and said he would be at Ashenvale on the Saturday of the following week. She read it in the study with the portrait of him at the edge of her vision, that measured painted face with the gray eyes that were close to right. She went to tell Mrs. Holt. Mrs. Holt was, Eleanor noticed, already consulting with William about the south wing. The 2 of them were in the corridor with a list, which meant the housekeeper had been prepared for this, and had been preparing since the first conversation. Eleanor stood for a moment and watched them without announcing herself, and felt something that was precisely the feeling of being in a house that worked, that knew itself, that had people in it who cared about what they were doing. She went upstairs and stood at the door of the south wing. She had been in these rooms regularly to ensure they were maintained, but she had not tried to imagine Edmund in them until now. She opened the door and walked through. The bedroom was large and south-facing, good light even in winter. The sitting room had a bookshelf. She had put books there from the library, ones she thought might be of interest to him based on what she knew. She looked at them now. She had made the selection naturally, without ceremony, because it was simply the kind of thing she did. She realized, standing there, that she had been preparing for this longer than she had admitted to herself. She left the south wing and went to the library. and got out the old woman's journal from the shelf. She had not read it for months. She opened it and found, near the end, an entry she did not remember from previous readings. The handwriting was more uneven here than in earlier entries. Older, probably. The pen not quite so steady. She had written, "He came home in October, after a year abroad. We were strangers, and not strangers simultaneously. It was one of the strangest experiences of my life, and one of the better ones." Eleanor read it twice. Then she put the journal back on its shelf and went to her desk and wrote in her own, "I found something in the old journal. She says strange and better simultaneously. I am inclined to trust her on that, as I have trusted her on everything else." The days before Edmund's arrival were the most unusual Eleanor could remember. Not dramatic. She did not allow them to be dramatic, because that would have required her to treat his return as something other than what it was, which was a man coming home to his own house. She continued her morning rides and her work with Mrs. Holt and her Friday teas with Francis and her Saturday afternoons in the library with Owen, who knew nothing about any of this and was serenely occupied with a problem in geometry that was keeping him very happily busy. But there was a different quality to the days, a kind of heightened noticing. She found herself paying attention to things she had long taken for granted, the specific sound of the great hall fire, the smell of Mrs. Bray's kitchen in the morning, the way the light came through the library windows at 4 in the afternoon, low and warm, touching the spines of the books. She was noticing it all as if storing it, which she realized was because she was about to see it through someone else's eyes. She was about to see this place, that she had made, through the eyes of the man who had given it to her without knowing what she would do with it. On the Thursday before he arrived, she went to the South Tower one more time. The day was clear, which was unusual for February, and the moor stretched out in every direction under a sky that was the pale, honest blue of winter when the cloud lifts. The village smoke rose straight up. She could see the schoolroom windows. Francis had the lamp lit already, the days still short. She could see Henry Bolt's farm and the track from the east lane and the corner of the kitchen garden where the south wall caught the sun. She stood there for a long time. She let herself feel all of it, the love of it, the ownership of it, the 5 years of work that lived in every field and every repaired gate, and every child who could read something they could not read 2 years ago. She let herself feel it fully. And then she turned and went down the stairs to prepare for whatever came next. She did not move anything from her study. She did not change anything about the way she lived or worked or occupied the castle. She had promised him the truth, and the truth was a woman who had made herself at home in a place that had been empty, and who was not going to unmake herself to make room. He was going to have to meet her as she was. She was ready for that. He arrived on a Tuesday afternoon in February, which Eleanor had not expected. His last letter had said Saturday. But the carriage came up the drive at 3 o'clock on a Tuesday, when the sky was the color of iron, and the moor beyond the garden was running with the kind of cold that settles rather than gusts. She saw it from the upstairs window of her study. She put down her pen. She did not rush. She took a breath. She looked at the portrait on the edge of her desk for a moment. Then she walked downstairs at the pace she always walked. Not slow, not hurried, simply the pace of a woman moving through her own house. Mrs. Holt was already in the entrance hall. William was at the door. Everything was in order, because it was always in order, because that was what 5 years of proper management looked like. Eleanor stood at the foot of the stair. The door opened, cold air came in first, and then Edmund Harcastle, the Duke of Ashenvale, stood in the entrance hall of his own castle and looked at it. She watched his face. She had prepared herself not to expect too much from it, prepared herself for the possibility that it would be composed and contained in the way she had always imagined it, that gray-eyed distance she had studied for months. She had prepared herself to find the man in the room different from the man in the letters, and to deal with that honestly. She had not prepared herself for him to simply stop. He stood still in the entrance hall with his coat still on and his bag in the hand of the footman who had taken it, and he stopped and looked. He looked at the walls, which were clean and properly lit. He looked at the floor, which was polished and sound. He looked at the fireplace, which had a fire burning that drew perfectly, because the chimney had been cleared in year 2 and maintained since. He looked at the curtains, which had been replaced in year 3 when the old ones had become too far gone. He looked at the stairs, at the windows, at the small table by the door that held a vase of winter branches. Not flowers. There were none in February, but branches, with a certain deliberate quality. He looked at all of it. And then he looked at Eleanor. She had thought about what she would feel when she saw him. She had thought about it with her characteristic honesty, trying to anticipate so that she would not be thrown by whatever she found. She had told herself she might feel strange. She had told herself she might feel distant, or warm, or some combination that had no name. What she felt, standing at the foot of the stair looking at a man she had known only in letters for 5 years, was the precise sensation of seeing something she recognized, and not from before. She had barely known his face before. From the letters, from the man who had written about Owen's scholarship with genuine pleasure, about the South Tower with real feeling, about the words left unsaid with the particular shame of someone who understands what they cost. She looked at his face and found the letters in it. He was thinner than the portrait. He looked, not unwell, but as though he had not been sleeping enough for a while. The gray eyes were exactly right. "Your Grace," he said. Then he stopped. He tried again. "Eleanor." It was the first time he had used her name. In 6 years of marriage and 5 years of correspondence, he had never once written her name in a letter. She had noticed this without addressing it. Now he said it in the entrance hall of Ashenvale, and she said his. "Edmund," she said. There was a pause that was not uncomfortable. It was the pause of two people who have a great deal to say, and are choosing not to say all of it at once. Mrs. Holt moved, with the graceful invisibility of a very good housekeeper, to take his coat. William appeared with tea. Eleanor said, "Come through to the library. It is warm." He followed her. She was aware of him behind her, looking at everything as they walked. She had a sudden understanding of what it felt like to show someone a place that had been yours alone for a long time. She kept walking. In the library, she sat in her usual chair and he sat in the one across from it. And William brought tea and closed the door. The fire was going well. The winter light from the west window came in flat and warm. He looked around the library. His eyes found the books, found the particular organization of the shelves, which she had rearranged in year 1 and not changed since. He found the old woman's journal on its shelf. "What is that?" he said. She told him. She watched his face as she told him about finding it, what was in it, what it had given her. He listened with his full attention, which she was learning was something he did not give easily or perform. "May I read it?" he said. "Yes," she said. "It is not private." She intended it, I think, to be found eventually. He did not reach for it yet. He looked at the fire. Then he said, "The drive looks different. I had the trees pruned 5 years ago. They are better." "Yes," she said. He looked at the fire again. "You know, I drove up slowly," he said. "I kept telling the driver to go slower. I wanted to see it all, every change." She thought about this. "What did you see?" He was quiet for a moment. "The roof," he said. "That was the first thing. The east wing, the tiles." He paused. "I could see from the drive that it was new work. I should have done that before I left." "Yes," she said. She did not soften it. He had said he wanted the truth. He accepted it without flinching. "I should have done a great many things before I left." "What stopped you?" He looked at her. It was the most direct look he had given her, and she held it steadily. He said, "I did not know how to begin. I had inherited something that was failing, and I did not know. I understood the scale of what was wrong, but I did not know where to start. And I told myself that what was needed was money, and that I would go and arrange the money, and come back. But that was not entirely true. What was the rest of it?" He was quiet for a long moment. "I am better at a distance," he said. "I have always known this. I think better when I am writing. When I am present, I become—" He paused, looking for the word. "I hesitate," he said. "I find it very difficult to act without being certain first." And here, everything required action before certainty was possible. Eleanor looked at him for a while. She thought about what he was describing. She thought about the man in the letters who was measured and careful, and who acted best from a distance. And she thought about the man who had been sitting in cities across Europe writing to her about a schoolroom, and a child's scholarship, and a folded corner in a poetry book. "You found a way," she said. "In the letters." "Yes," he said. "You made it possible. I do not know if you know how much." She looked at the fire. "I know what the letters became," she said. "I have all of them." "So do I," he said. She looked at him. "Yours," he said. "I kept them all." She had assumed he had. She had not let herself think about what that meant until now, sitting in the library, hearing him say it. "They are yours to keep," she said. The first evening was like the first letter had been. Careful, finding its way. They had supper in the dining room, the two of them at one end of the long table. Mrs. Bray had made something good, roast chicken with winter vegetables, and they ate it and talked about practical things first, because practical things were safe, and because there was real practical conversation to have. He had questions about the Moreland work that she answered from memory. She had questions about his London contacts that he answered with the particular recall of a man who had been thinking about how to be useful. They talked about Owen, whom Edmund had never met and whose scholarship result he had followed in letters with genuine attention. She told him Owen would be leaving for Edinburgh in September. I would like to meet him before he goes, Edmund said. He comes to the library on Saturdays, she said. Edmund looked at her. May I come to the library on Saturday? She realized he was asking permission to be in his own library. She realized why he was asking. She said, yes, of course. He nodded. He looked at his plate. He said, I will try not to displace anything. She thought about that. You will not, she said. There is room. After supper, he asked to see the east wing. She took him through. She watched his face in the lamplight as she showed him the schoolroom, the desks in their rows, the books on the shelf, the board at the front with the week's lessons still chalked on it. He stood in the doorway and looked at it for a long time. How many children? He said. 18 now, she said. We started with 14. He was quiet. He reached out and touched the doorframe, just briefly, and then took his hand back. She showed him the rest of the wing, the rooms that had been opened and made useful, the storeroom that was now a proper larder, the room that had held the china, now converted to a sewing room for the household. He walked through all of it and said little, but he was paying attention with every part of himself. In the last room, the one that had been the old store for broken furniture, he stopped. This was empty, he said. Yes, your father's time. What is it used for now? Francis Lee, the teacher, uses it for individual work with children who need more help. Ruth Warwick uses it on Thursday afternoons. She is 11, and she reads 3 years ahead of herself, and she needs harder material. He looked at the small room with its one window and its 2 chairs and its shelf of books. He said, You knew her name. She waved at me from the road in my second autumn, Eleanor said. I do not forget people who notice me. He turned and looked at her. In the lamplight, his face was clearer than it had been in the entrance hall, closer, and different in the way that faces seen in quiet light are different from faces seen from across a room. She is fortunate, he said, to have been noticed by you. Eleanor held his gaze for a moment. Then she said, Come, I will show you the kitchen garden plans for spring. She walked ahead, and he followed, and outside the February dark was complete and absolute, and the castle was lit from within. Every window that should have light in it showing light, warm and steady against the black of the moor, and the white edge of frost beginning on the grass. That night, Eleanor went to her study and sat at the desk for a long time. She did not write. She sat with the day, with the weight of it, the surprise of it, the particular quality of recognition she had felt when she looked at him and found the letters there. He was not easy. She had not expected easy. He was careful and he hesitated, and he had 30 years of habit to move through in order to be present, and she could see all of that plainly. It would take time. It would take patience. But he was real. The man in the letters was real, and she had found him in the room. She took out her journal and wrote one paragraph. She wrote, He arrived on Tuesday. He is thinner than the portrait and his eyes are right, and he asked permission to come to the library on Saturday, as though it were not his own library, which I think is the most important thing he has done today. I told him there was room. I think that is the most important thing I have done. She closed the journal. She looked at the portrait, the young man who was now a man of 40, somewhere in the south wing tonight, in the room she had kept maintained and ready. She thought, he came home. She thought, now we begin. She went to bed. The castle settled around her in its ordinary way, the tick and creak of stone in the cold, the good draw of the chimney, the absolute silence of the moor. And from somewhere in the south wing, a light was showing under a door, the faint edge of it visible from the corridor when she passed on her way to her room. He was reading. She had no way of knowing what, but the light was on, which was new, and it was warm, and it was proof that there was someone else in the house for the first time in 5 years. She went to bed and did not lie awake. She slept at once, and well. The first week was the strangest. Eleanor had expected adjustment, but she had not anticipated the specific strangeness of 2 people occupying a large house who had corresponded for 5 years and yet did not know how to simply be in a room together. They were not uncomfortable in a painful way. It was more precise than that. They were 2 people who had learned each other's minds thoroughly at a distance, and were now in the process of learning each other's presence, which was an entirely different thing. He came downstairs in the mornings before she did, which she had not expected. She had assumed he was a late riser because the correspondence had often contained references to late evenings and she had made a reasonable inference. She was wrong. On the second morning she came down to find him already in the dining room with a cup of coffee and a newspaper, and he looked up when she came in, with an expression that she could only describe as caught, as if he had been doing something private in a place he was not sure he was welcome. She sat down. William brought her breakfast. They ate for a few minutes in a silence that was not quite easy and not quite difficult. Then Edmund said, I found there are ducks on the south pond. Yes, she said. Since year 3. A pair arrived in spring and stayed. I named them, which Mrs. Holt considers undignified. He looked at her with the expression that was becoming familiar, a focused attention that was always slightly surprised by her, as if she kept doing things that adjusted his picture. What did you name them? The drake is Edmund, she said, and then held very still. There was a pause. Then he said carefully, and the duck? Eleanor, she said. He looked at the window, then he looked back at his coffee. She thought for a moment that she had made a mistake. Then she saw the side of his mouth shift, very slightly, in the way that, she was learning, was his version of a genuine smile. Are they well? He said. Very well, she said. Fat and argumentative and entirely in charge of the south garden when they want to be. He picked up his coffee. He said, Good. They ate the rest of breakfast without speaking much, but the silence had changed quality. It was the silence of people who have found something, not the silence of people who are looking. The Saturday library visit with Owen went differently from how Eleanor had anticipated. She had imagined introducing them formally, the Duke, the scholarship boy, and had prepared herself for a certain awkwardness. What she got was something else entirely. Owen arrived at the usual time, let himself in at the side door that had been left open for him as always, came to the library, and found Eleanor and Edmund both there. He stopped in the doorway. He looked at Edmund with the careful assessing look that Eleanor had noticed he gave to everything he was not sure about. Edmund looked at him. He said, You are Owen. Owen said, Yes. Edmund said, I am the Duke. I have been reading your letters from Edinburgh about the scholarship process. They were very clear. Owen, who had not known his letters were being forwarded from the Edinburgh committee to Edmund, processed this for a moment. Then he said, Was the geometry problem clear? I was not sure about my explanation of the second part. Edmund blinked. Which geometry problem? In the application. The committee asked for a worked example of a complex proof, and I chose the one about parallel lines and the angle relationships. I was not certain my language was precise enough. There was a pause. I did not read that section, Edmund said. Oh, said Owen. He considered this. Would you like to see it? I have the draft. He said this with the complete simplicity of a person who is too interested in the mathematics to remember to be socially cautious. He produced the draft from his bag. He always brought his work in case Eleanor had thoughts, and set it on the table. Edmund sat down. Owen sat next to him and pointed to the second part of the proof. They were together for 40 minutes. Eleanor sat in her chair and read her book and listened to the conversation happening 6 feet from her, which was mostly Owen explaining and Edmund asking questions that were, she noted, genuinely good questions, not the polite questions of someone performing interest. When Owen left, Edmund sat for a moment and then said, He is extraordinary. Yes, she said. You found him by luck, he said. He was already there. A lot of things were already there, she said. That is what I found when I started looking. He looked at her. The library light was good in the afternoon, the west window bringing the low winter sun in at an angle that lit the room warmly. He said, I am going to tell you something that I have wanted to say in a letter for some time and could not find the right way. She set her book down. When I left, he said, I believed I was doing you a service. I believed that I was the thing that would make the estate harder, not easier to manage. I believed that I would hesitate too long and decide too slowly, and that you would do better without me in the way. He paused. I want you to know that I understand now how completely wrong that was, not because you did not manage. Clearly you did, and you did it far better than I could have, but because I made a decision about what you needed without asking you. And that was, he stopped. He looked at his hands. That was not right, he said. I am sorry for it. She was quiet for a while. She thought about all the things she could say. She thought about the early months, the loneliness she had not let herself name, the nights when the castle was too large, and too quiet, and too full of the absence of another human being who was supposed to be there. She thought about the years after, when the loneliness had transformed into something else, something productive and almost good. She thought about what it had cost her, and what it had given her, and how those two things could not be cleanly separated. You should have asked me, she said. That is the truth. You should have stayed long enough to ask what I wanted. He met her eyes. Yes, he said. But I understand why you did not, she said. And I am not certain. I have thought about this a great deal. I am not certain that what I became would have happened if you had stayed. That is not a justification for what you did, but it is a fact I have to hold alongside the other facts. You are more fair to me than I deserve, he said. I am not being fair, she said. I am being honest. Those are different things. He looked at her in the way he had been looking at her all week. That focused, slightly surprised attention. He said, I know. You have always been honest. Even in the very early letters, when I was not being much of anything in return. She thought about those early letters, his 3 sentences, her careful 3 in return, the long, slow months of 2 people not quite finding the frequency on which they could speak to each other. She said, You got better at it. You made it possible to get better at it, he said. You answered. You kept answering. You made it clear that there was something to be answered to. She thought about all those evenings at the desk, all the letters she had written, the careful choosing of what to say and what to hold back, and when to let something through that was real. She thought about the 7 journals full of things she had said to herself that she could not say to him yet. She thought about the letter where she had told him she thought of him at the South Tower, which she had sent before she could stop herself. I should tell you something, she said. He waited. When I said I thought of you at the tower, in the letter, in year 5, I was telling you the truth. I did think of you. I think of you there now too, which is strange because I had never met you, but I knew exactly why you went there. He was very still. And I think, she continued, that we are 2 people who are better known to each other than most people who have lived together for 5 years, and also 2 people who are almost strangers in person. And I do not know exactly what to do with that, but I know that I do not want to pretend it is not true. He said after a moment, I do not want to pretend either. Good, she said. There was a quiet between them that was full rather than empty. She looked at the fire. He looked at it too. Outside, the February afternoon was failing early, the light going gray, the moor disappearing into early dark. He said, May I ask you something? Yes. The harvest supper. In November. 43 people. Yes. Were you happy that evening? She thought about the question seriously. Yes, she said. It was one of the best evenings of my life. He nodded slowly. I was in Vienna, he said. I read your letter about it 3 times. I told myself it was practical information, but I read it 3 times. She said nothing. He said, I wanted to be there. I know, she said, because she had known, reading that letter. She had known it and had let herself know it, carefully, without building too much on it. Next year, he said, I would like to be there. She looked at him. He was looking at the fire, his hands on his knees, the careful, controlled person who had learned to feel things through the distance of letters, slowly learning to say them in a room. Next year, she said, you will be. He looked at her then, really looked, direct and open in a way she had not seen from him before, not even in the week since he had arrived. She held his gaze and did not look away. It was not a grand moment. It was not dramatic. It was a man and a woman in a library in winter, with the fire going and the books on their shelves and the heather outside under a dusting of early frost, finding their way toward each other at last. The days continued to build on each other. He came to the morning rides. She had not expected this, but he appeared one morning in the stable yard in practical riding clothes while she was saddling Callie, and he looked at the second horse, a younger gelding she had acquired in year 3, and said, May I? He is called Arthur, she said, after the builder. Edmund looked at the horse. The horse looked back at him with the equine version of measured assessment. After the builder, Edmund repeated. He did excellent work, she said. It seemed right. They rode out together. He knew the estate well. He had grown up here, and the knowledge of it was in his hands on the reins, in the way he turned without instruction at the right places on the track. But he kept pausing. He kept stopping to look at things she had changed or repaired or improved, and the quality of his looking was that of a person revising a memory against a reality. At Henry Bolt's farm they stopped. Henry was in the yard. He saw them and stood for a moment, looking from Edmund to Eleanor with the expression of a man sorting out what this moment required. Then he said, with the plainness of someone who has decided that plain speaking is the right tool, Your Grace, you have been away a long time. I have, said Edmund. Henry looked at Eleanor, then back at Edmund. She kept it well, he said. She did, said Edmund, better than well. Henry nodded once, as if this confirmed something. He went back to what he was doing. Edmund watched him go. Then he looked at Eleanor, and she saw, in his face, something that was close to gratitude, and too complicated for that one word. They rode home mostly in silence, the good silence of people moving through a landscape they share. As they came back in the drive, the lime trees casting their winter shapes on either side, Edmund said, Your father wrote to me. She looked at him. When? 2 years ago, he said. He wrote to tell me that the estate was in good hands and that he hoped I was well, and that I should not wait too long before I came home. She stared at him. He never told me. No, Edmund said. He told me he was not going to. He said it was between me and my conscience. He paused. He was right, it was. She thought about her father writing that letter. She thought about him deciding not to tell her, not wanting to put hope into her that might not find its answer. She thought, he knew me. He knew not to make me wait on someone else's decision. She thought, he was right, and Edmund was right to come when he was ready, and she had been right to build what she built, without waiting for either of them. She said, I will write to him tonight. Tell him, Edmund said, that I have taken his advice. I will, she said. She did. She wrote to her father that evening, a longer letter than usual, because there was more to say. She told him about the Tuesday arrival, and the ducks and the library with Owen, and the conversation by the fire. She told him about the harvest supper and the South Tower and all the things she had built, which he already knew, but she told him in a new way. Not the way you report to a parent, but the way you speak to someone who loves you about things that matter. At the end she wrote, he is learning. I am learning. We are both much better at that than we would have been 5 years ago. Perhaps that was always necessary. Perhaps we both needed to become the right people first. She sealed it. She went to bed. Upstairs in the south wing, the light was on again, and she had come to understand in the 10 days since his return that he was a man who read late, not from restlessness, but because reading was where he was most himself, most settled, most able to be the person he actually was without the effort that the world required of men in his position. She understood that about him. She understood it because of the letters, because of the 5 years of learning at a distance that had given her access to the inside of a person she had never seen at ease. She was looking forward to seeing that. She thought, lying in the dark with the moor outside and the castle warm around her, we have time now. There is no more distance to manage. We have the same roof and the same table and the same drive up which the lime trees are growing the way they should, and we have years ahead of us in which to learn the rest. She thought, I am not afraid of any of it. That was new. That was the best new thing of all. The kitchen garden gate latch was broken again in March. Not badly. The pin had simply worked loose from the wood over the winter, the way things do when wood contracts in the cold and expands in the thaw. Eleanor had noticed it on a Tuesday morning and added it to the list she kept in her pocket notebook, meaning to speak to Arthur Finch or one of the groundskeepers about it. She did not get the chance, because on Thursday morning she went through the garden and the latch was mended. She stood at the gate and looked at it. The repair was clean and solid, the pin reset and countersunk, a small plate added on the back to strengthen the post. She ran her thumb over it. Good work. She had not asked anyone to do it, which meant someone had noticed and done it unprompted. She went inside and found Edmund in the dining room finishing his coffee. The gate, she said. He looked up. The latch was loose. She looked at him for a moment. He met her gaze with the expression she was coming to know well, that careful, slightly careful attention that was his version of openness. He had not made a speech about it. He had not told her he was going to do it. He had seen it was broken and fixed it and said nothing, and the fixing was a language all its own, which she was learning to read. Thank you, she said. He looked back at his coffee. It only took a few minutes. That was all. But she carried it with her all day. The gate, the clean repair, the fact of a man who had been away for 5 years finding, in a small practical task, the first way he knew how to say something that neither of them had words for yet. Spring came with its particular northern energy, the long cold suddenly giving way in a week to something green and forceful, the birds arriving loud, the moor beginning its slow change from winter to the beginning of life. Eleanor rode out every morning and Edmund came with her most days. They had fallen into a rhythm that felt, by April, almost natural, easy in a way that she would not have predicted in February, but which made sense when she considered how much ground they had already covered in letters. The schoolroom continued. Frances's Thursday afternoon sessions with Ruth Warwick had expanded into a small advanced group, 3 children who needed more than the standard lessons. Eleanor had arranged for an additional 2 afternoons per week, and Frances had taken this on with the same practical enthusiasm she brought to everything. Edmund had sat in on one of the sessions in March, at the back of the room, having asked Eleanor first whether this would be welcome. She had asked Frances, who had said that children who were used to doing real work were not usually distracted by observers. He had sat very quietly in the corner for an hour and a half. At one point Ruth, who apparently could not help herself, had looked at him directly and said, "Are you the Duke?" "Yes," he said. "Is it your castle?" "It is," he said. She thought about this with the visible concentration she brought to most things. Then she said, "Eleanor built the schoolroom." "I know," he said. Ruth appeared to reach a judgment and returned to her work. Edmund looked at Eleanor across the room, and Eleanor looked back, and neither of them said anything, because there was nothing that needed saying. Owen's departure for Edinburgh in September was a day that Eleanor had been preparing herself for since the scholarship letter had come. She had known the boy for nearly 4 years. He had been a regular presence in the library, a steady weekly fixture of Saturday afternoons, and serious arithmetic, and the particular satisfaction of watching a mind work at the top of its capacity. She was not sentimental about the going. She was glad of it, entirely glad, which was the only emotion that really made sense given what the going meant. But she was also aware of the particular feeling that comes when something you have built fulfills its purpose and moves past you. Edmund had met Owen half a dozen times by September. They had a rapport that Eleanor found quietly remarkable. Two reserved, precise people who communicated mostly through questions, and who had apparently decided that the questions were enough. Edmund had given Owen a book from the library, a well-used volume on advanced mathematics that had a name written in it that Eleanor did not recognize, and Owen had received it with the gravity it deserved. On the morning Owen left, his mother brought him to the castle to say goodbye. They stood in the entrance hall, the same entrance hall where Eleanor had stood on her first day with the iron key and the smell of dust and the sense of a very large and very empty place. The hall now had a fire and flowers on the table, and the sound of the house functioning behind it, Mrs. Bray in the kitchen, Frances setting up the schoolroom above. Owen shook Edmund's hand first, which was correct, and which Owen had the social awareness to know was correct. Then he turned to Eleanor. He was 14 now, and had grown 4 inches in the last year, and was trying not to show that he was affected by the morning. Eleanor did not pretend not to notice. She said, "You have everything you need." "Yes," he said. "Write to Frances," she said. "And to me." "Yes," he said. She did not try to hug him, because she did not think he would know what to do with that. She said, "We will be very interested to hear about the geometry." His mouth shifted, the closest he came to a real smile. "I will send you the proofs," he said. "Do," she said. He left. His mother thanked Eleanor 3 times in the doorway, pressing her hand. Eleanor received this warmly, and then stood at the window and watched the cart go down the drive under the lime trees, now in their autumn color, and felt the specific sadness and pride of sending someone into the world you helped make possible. Edmund appeared at her shoulder. He did not say anything. He stood there, close enough that she was aware of him, and they watched the cart until it turned at the gate and was gone. She went to her study and wrote in her journal, "Owen left this morning. I think he will do something remarkable. I think we will read about it one day." She paused and then added, "We will, both of us. Together." That word, together, had been finding its way into her writing more often since February. She noticed this and examined it, and decided it was accurate and left it alone. The harvest supper in November of the first year of Edmund's return was the one she had told him he would be at. He was. He was there for all of it. For the setting up of the tables in the afternoon, which he helped with, moving trestles with William in a way that made William visibly uncertain about the correct response, and then apparently decide to simply accept it. He was there when the guests arrived, standing beside Eleanor in the entrance to the great hall, meeting people he had not met in years or had never met at all, doing the difficult work of learning names and faces and histories in a single evening. He did not find this easy. She could see it cost him, the effort of full presence, of being in a room and actually being there. But he did not step back. Dorothy Webb, who was nobody's fool, shook Edmund's hand and then looked from him to Eleanor with the particular expression of a woman who has been watching a situation for years and has reached a conclusion she finds satisfying. She said nothing. She did not need to. Geoffrey Rowe played the fiddle again. The children who had been at the supper the previous year were a year older, and some of them danced, which they had not done before. Ruth Warwick danced with a concentrated seriousness that made Frances, sitting next to Eleanor at the table, lean over and say quietly, "She treats every new skill as if it is going to be on an examination." "Good," Eleanor said. Edmund was at the other end of the table, talking with Henry Bolt. This had not been arranged. Eleanor had not introduced them. She had watched it happen. Edmund finding his way to the farmer, or the farmer finding his way to Edmund. It was hard to say which. And what she could see from a distance was that Henry Bolt was speaking with more ease than she had seen him speak with anyone outside his immediate circle. Edmund was listening with his full attention. She thought, "He is learning. He is slower at it than I am, and he came later to it than I did, but he is learning." After supper, when most people had left and the children were being collected and the tables were being cleared, Eleanor stood in the doorway of the great hall the way she had stood the year before. The fires were burning down. The hall was warm with the warmth of 40 people and 2 hours of laughter and talking and good food. The evidence of the evening was everywhere. The moved chairs, the crumbs, the living proof of use. Edmund came to stand beside her. "Last year," she said, "I stood here alone." "I know," he said. "You told me in a letter." "This is better," she said. "Yes," he said. They stood there for a while, side by side, looking at the empty hall. The fire crackled. Outside, the November dark was complete and cold, the moor under the kind of sky that comes on still nights in autumn, full of stars in the gaps between cloud. He said, "I have been thinking about something I want to tell you." She waited. "When I left," he said, "I told myself many things about why it was the right decision. I told myself you would be freer without me. I told myself the estate needed money more than management, and that I could provide money more usefully from a distance. I told myself that I was not the kind of man who could run a place like this, that I was too slow, too uncertain, too much in my own head." He paused. "I want you to know that I know all of those things were partly true and mostly wrong. The partly true parts were about my limitations, but the mostly wrong parts were about you. I had no idea what you would do. I had no idea you were the kind of person who could do this. That was my failure. I should have stayed long enough to find out." She thought about this carefully. She thought about all the ways she could respond. She said, "You have been finding out for a year now." "Yes," he said. "What have you found?" He looked at her. The firelight from the hall was behind them, and she could see his face in the remaining warmth of it, and she saw the man she knew from the letters fully now. Not partially, not adjusted for reality, but whole. He said, "I have found that you are the steadiest person I have ever known, not because you do not feel things. I know you do. I can see it in how you work, in what you choose to fix and what you choose to keep, in the way you looked when Owen left in September. But you carry it without losing your footing. I have watched you for a year and I have never once seen you lose your footing." She was quiet. She felt his words settle in her, not as flattery. She was not someone who needed flattery and they both knew it, but as the specific satisfaction of being accurately known. She said, "You are not the man I thought I was marrying." He looked at her with something that was almost alarm. She let it sit for one moment and then said, "You are considerably better." He exhaled. The something that was almost alarm became something that was almost relief, and the relief became, slowly, the closest thing to warmth she had seen from him. Not performed, not polite, but real. "You are exactly," he said quietly, "what I should have stayed for." She looked at the hall, she looked at the fires, the chairs, the living evidence of use and warmth and people in a house that had been sealed and silent for years. She looked at all of it and felt, simply and without complication, mine, ours, real. She said, "Come on. Mrs. Bray will want to clear up and she will not do it with us standing here." He smiled then. She had seen it build over the months, the small shift of his mouth that she had learned, the one that was his version of a full smile. But this was more than that. This was a genuine, arriving smile, and she held it in her chest without comment. They went to help with the clearing up, which neither of them needed to do, and both of them did, because the house was theirs, and the work was theirs, and there was no reason to stand apart from either. Winter settled in. They spent the evenings in the library more often than not, him at the table with whatever he was reading, her in her usual chair, the fire between them, the house quiet outside. They talked when they had something to say, and read when they did not, and the silence between them had finished being the silence of careful people, and become the silence of two people who were at ease. She showed him the old journal in January, sitting in the library on a cold afternoon, when the snow had come, and the moor was white and still. He read the entry about the South Tower, and the one about the strawberries, and the one about large and silent things only being frightening, until you learn to look at them correctly. He read it all without speaking. When he had finished, he closed it carefully and looked at her. She knew what she was doing, he said, which was almost exactly what her father had said. "Yes," Eleanor said. "She left me something. She left you something too, in a way. She kept the place worth coming back to." He held the journal for a moment. "So did you," he said. She took it from him and put it back on the shelf. "We should write to the Edinburgh Committee," she said. "Owen's first results will be through soon and I want to ask if they share them with supporters." "I will write," he said. "I know the professor." She looked at him. "You know him directly?" "We were at school together," he said. "Briefly. We have corresponded since the committee got involved." She stared. "You never told me that." "I did not want to." He paused. "I wanted it to be yours. The schoolroom, the scholarship, all of it. I did not want to make it seem as though I had arranged it. I only provided the connection. What was done with it was yours." She thought about this. She thought about the years of work and the letters and the things he had offered that were always somehow placed at a slight remove, always wrapped in a language of assistance rather than ownership, because he was trying not to take up the space she had made for herself. She said, "Edmund." He looked at her. "You are allowed to be part of it," she said. "You are allowed to have built some of it too. I am not going to become less for your being here." He looked at her for a long moment, then he said, "I am still learning that." "I know," she said. "You are learning it well." He looked at the fire. She looked at the fire. The house moved around them in its familiar winter voice, the tick of stone, the settle of timber, the draw of the flue, all the particular sounds of a building that has been properly attended to and knows it. She thought about the iron key. She had kept it all these years, not on her desk any longer, but in the drawer, with the letters. The key and the letters and the journals and the old woman's journal on the shelf and the children's drawings that Frances had pinned in the schoolroom corridor and the gate latch that Edmund had fixed without saying a word. All of it together, accumulated over 6 years, the material evidence of a life that had been built out of a transaction and had become something else entirely. She had not wasted it. She had told herself on the first night, in the dark of a strange castle with the wind on the moor and the iron key on the writing desk, that she would not waste this. Whatever it was, she would not waste it. She had not. In spring, she planted a second strawberry bed. Edmund came out to help her. They worked in the kitchen garden in the March morning, the wall at their backs holding the warmth, and the conversation between them moved easily from the planting to Frances's plan for the summer lessons, to the tenant meeting she had scheduled for the following week, to the question of whether Arthur Finch might be persuaded to look at the South Tower stair, which had developed a loose step she wanted addressed. He handed her the stakes for the bed. She placed them. He held the cord level while she marked the rows. They worked side by side in the ordinary way of people who have done this kind of thing together before. And the ordinary was new, and was the best kind of new, the kind that feels like it was always there. George Parr was mending something at the corner of his fence line that afternoon when Eleanor rode past. He raised a hand. She raised hers. She turned Callie toward home. The lime trees on the drive were in their first spring leaf, pale and new and moving slightly in the April wind. The castle stood on its rise the way it had always stood, stone and certain, but with light in every window that should have light and smoke from every chimney, and the sound, when she rode close enough, of the house being alive in all the ways that a house is supposed to be. She came in through the stable yard and unsaddled Callie herself. She brushed her down and gave her the apple she kept in her coat pocket for this purpose. The mare ate it with the quiet pleasure of a horse who has learned that this particular person is reliable. Eleanor went inside. Edmund was in the library. She could hear him before she turned the corner. Not his voice, but the sound of him in a room, which she had become accustomed to over 15 months, the small sounds of his presence that had become part of the house's daily rhythm. She went in. He looked up. She sat in her chair. He went back to reading. She picked up her book. The fire burned steadily. The house spoke in its low, settled voice. Outside, the April light was failing in the slow northern way, the moor going from pale gold to gray, to the particular darkness that she had come to love, which was not absence but presence, the moor breathing quietly in the dark, full of its own life, the heather beginning already to think about what it would do in August. She opened her book. Then she closed it again. She said, "I am glad you came back." He did not look up immediately. When he did, she could see that he was deciding how to say the thing he was going to say, choosing it carefully the way he chose everything. He said, "I should have come back sooner." "Yes," she said, "but you are here now." He looked at her with everything he had not been able to say for years, everything the letters had held and the absence had held and the distance had held, and she looked back with everything she had not needed to say because she had been too busy building something worth coming back to. She had given him a name, once, without intending to. She had given the duck his name on a cold morning in year 3 because she had been thinking about him, and the duck had seemed the right size for a thought she was not ready to say aloud. The thought, all these years later, was ready. She did not say it as a sentence, because it did not need to be a sentence. She simply held his gaze in the firelight and let him read it there, which she had learned was how Edmund received things best. Not spoken at him but shown, not delivered but offered. He put down his book. He said, "The name you wrote in the first letter, I kept it. I kept all of them." "I know," she said. He said, "I read them more than I should have admitted." "I know that too," she said. The fire moved. Outside, the dark was full and complete, and the stars were coming out over the moor, the old stars that had been there before the castle and would be there after it, indifferent to everything below them and magnificent anyway. Inside, a woman who had come to a strange house with a key and nothing else, and made it the truest place she had ever been, sat beside a man who had learned, late and carefully and honestly, to deserve what she had built. And it was enough. It was, in fact, more than enough. It was everything.